6:30, let's get started. I know Kevin will be right along. A good turnout this evening. If we could just, for Alan's benefit, starting with Samantha, if you don't mind going around, welcome Susan. Go around and say you're here and tell your name so that Alan can record it.
Great. Sam Phillips, MEMA Director.
Pat Charamel, representing the Old Colony Planning Council.
Susan Whitaker, representing the Executive Office of Housing and Economic Development.
Did you hear that okay, Alan? Susan Whitaker, Economic Development and Housing.
Joe Coughlin, Town of Plymouth, Nuclear Matters Committee.
Pine Dubois, appointed by the Speaker of the House.
Bob Hayden, Mass Department of Public Utilities.
Dave Johnston, Mass DEP, on behalf of the Secretary of Environmental Affairs.
Robert Jones, Health and Human Services.
Rich Grassi, the House Minority Leader.
Sean Mullen, the Senate Minority Leader.
Dave Nichols, appointed by Governor Baker.
John Mahoney, Plymouth Board of Select Persons.
John Moylan, Decommissioning Director. I'm not Brian Sullivan, not to confuse anybody.
You're much taller and better looking.
Oh, I don't, I'll let him know that.
Pat O'Brien, the Pilgrim Station.
Jack Priest, Director Radiation Control Program, Department of Public Health.
Rich Rothstein, Town of Plymouth Board of Selectmen appointee.
Paul Smith, appointed by the Utility Workers Union of America to represent the good men and women who work at Pilgrim Station.
Dan Wolf, appointed by the Senate President.
Thank you. Did you get them all, Alan? Excellent, thank you. Just one housekeeping thing before we get to the minutes. I know you're enjoying the accommodations, but this will be our last meeting here. Starting next month in November, we're meeting, hello, Mr. O'Reilly. We'll be meeting, starting next month in the Selectmen's area, the Great Hall at Town Hall. So I know I sent it out before. I'm going to send it out again with the parking instructions, but next month's meeting will be there.
Where is that, Sean?
It's the Town Hall in Plymouth, Great Hall. in Plymouth.
The new Town Hall, Rich.
The new Town Hall.
You got Newtown?
It was very expensive. So with that, let's take a look at the minutes from the previous meeting. Did everybody get them on time? And Alan, thank you very much for getting them out as early as you could. Are there any changes, any edits, any comments on the minutes? Rich?
So on page 3, line 44, there's a sentence that needs one more word added to it that was left out.
Yeah, which, I don't have the line
Okay,
up.
well, the sentence reads, Mr. Rothstein asked about Holtec's off-site storage facility in New Mexico and how Pilgrim spent fuel will be prioritized with regard to removal of its spent fuel. The word proposed was inadvertently left out in the draft minutes. It should be asked about Holtec's proposed off-site storage facility.
Okay. Did you
Still in
catch,
the planning stages.
did you get that okay, Alan? Okay. Any other?
Yeah.
Yes, Rich.
Just, the gentleman, Alan, I believe may not be here next time. He does such a wonderful job. I would encourage the chair to hopefully find somebody that can do an equal job.
I didn't realize. Alan, this is your last meeting?
Thursdays are kind of a conflict for me. So
Really? We should have gotten you a cake or something. Well, we'll figure it out over the next meeting. You have done a great job, though, as you know. Thank you. Any other changes? Thank you for that, Rich.
Move to accept.
Second.
Any discussion on the motion? Hearing none. All in favor, say aye. Aye. Nay? Abstain? Motion passes unanimously. Next piece of business is the update from Dave on the IWG, and we're very fortunate tonight to have a couple of other guests to speak. So with that, David, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Okay, thank you, Sean. So I'll start with some updates from the current actions with the NRC, and I unfortunately don't have a lot to report there. There's been no significant developments in the NRC proceedings. So I'll quickly recap some of those proceedings so that folks are current. And the First one of note was that on September 3rd, 2019, the Commonwealth filed a motion with the Commission seeking that they stay the staff's decision on the license transfer approval and the waiver determination. September 25th, on behalf of the Commonwealth, the Attorney General's office filed an appeal with the Washington, D.C. Circuit Court challenging the license approval. And we anticipate that Entergy and Holtec may seek to intervene on that. Maybe we can get an update in that regard. The original petition to intervene on the license proceeding filed by the Commonwealth on February 21st is still in front of the NRC. So really the bulk of the work that the interagency work group has been undertaking since we last met has to do with the Npdes permit. And as we've talked about in past meetings, the EPA has been working on the Npdes permit, and today they're joining us. They'll talk a little bit more about that. But so folks are aware that the Npdes permit is a National Pollution Discharge Elimination System permit, and that is the permit that Pilgrim has to discharge effluent into their discharge canal. That effluent has certain levels of pollutants, and those levels are addressed with the Npdes permit, excluding radionuclide discharges, and that we can talk a little bit more about that. And since we last met, EPA reached out to us to give us an update on the progress they're making, and they'll talk about that tonight. And just so that everyone understands how the process works, Massachusetts is one of just a handful of states for which primacy has not been taken. What that means is, in Massachusetts, there's a federal Clean Water Act requirement that the EPA makes sure is met through the Npdes permit discharge. There's also similar but distinct state Clean Water Act discharge requirements that the Commonwealth has to make sure are met. So the way we do that for efficiency is we work with EPA with the goal of issuing a joint discharge permit that will address both the federal and state Clean Waters Act requirements. In the bulk of the states where primacy has been accepted, EPA oversees how the state would implement a Npdes permit that met all the federal requirements as well as their own. So, obviously the goal is that we continue to protect the waters of the Commonwealth, and I know that EPA shares that goal. So, as we've talked about in the past meetings, the interagency work group is relatively fluid. A number of us are regular participating members here, Sam, Robert, Jack, and myself. And, but from time to time, as we need expertise, we ask folks to pipe in, and all of the agencies willingly add that additional expertise as needed. And tonight, joining us from Mass DEP is Leldon Langley, and I think Sean will probably introduce the folks from EPA, so I'm not going to take that. But I've worked with Leldon for decades, and Leldon is directing our National Pollution Discharge Elimination Program for DEP, and Leldon works in our Boston office. So that's really what I have, and at this point, I'd like to turn the rest of my time over, Sean, to these gentlemen.
Great. Before we ask you to speak with us, does anyone have any questions of David on his report for the last month? All right. Well, I think it's probably best if the Commonwealth start first, introduce each of you and what the role is that you play in it, and then tell us a little bit about where the process stands, and we'll take it from there.
Okay, so I'll just embellish a little bit on DJ's comments. So I'm Leldon Langley, the Director of the Division of Watershed Management, excuse me, which oversees the wastewater programs and the watershed planning program and the water management program at DEP. I'm based in the Boston office. One of the NPDES section chief, Susie King, reports to me, and we work collaboratively with EPA on Npdes permitting. This particular permit is, being considered for reissuance. We were going to allow our colleagues here at EPA to kind of sketch out some of the framework, some of which DJ's already done, if that's okay with you, kind of give you some of the setup, and then I will interject after that the role that we're playing, if that's okay.
Can everybody hear okay? Then, let's pull the mic in a little bit and see if it'll help. Okay. And they may need to spell your names if Alan can't get them.
Okay, well, thank you very much for having me. My name is Damian Houlihan. I'm the section chief.
Yeah, I can't hear him back there. Is the sound system not
It's a green
working?
light. I don't know. It's
Mike's
not
on.
working. Well, I can speak up if
Yeah,
I can try to project a little bit
do
more.
the best you can, and we'll get to the sound system.
Okay. My name's Damian Houlihan. I'm the section chief for the Industrial Permits Branch at the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency, and this is George Papadopoulos. I can spell his last name, but it's probably best if he spells it himself. He's a permit writer for the Pilgrim Nuclear Power Station. Again, thank you for having me here tonight. I'm going to give you a brief update of the status of the NPDS permit, where we are in the process and next steps. The Clean Water Act prohibits the discharge of pollutants, including heat, except in conformance with a National Pollutant Discharge Elimination System permit issued by EPA or an authorized state. As has been pointed out, Massachusetts is not authorized, hence the need for a federal permit. The act also requires that the location, design, construction, and capacity of the cooling water intake structure at the facility reflect the best technology available for minimizing adverse impacts. Those are the cooling water intake structures that facilities use to withdraw cooling water for plant operations. While the decommissioning process is overseen and regulated by the Nuclear Regulatory Commission in the same way the NRC regulates the operation of the nuclear power plant, licensees are required to comply with the Clean Water Act and its implementing regulations related to release of non-radioactive pollutants, as has been pointed out, within the meaning of the Clean Water Act. This does not include special nuclear materials, byproducts, or source materials in effluent. We released a draft permit for public comment and held a public hearing in the summer of 2016 in Plymouth. We got extensive comments on that permit, and we are busy wrapping up our work to issue the permit, which we hope to finish in the next couple of months. The draft permit authorized, it actually had two pieces because the power plant was still operating at the time. It authorized continued operation of the electrical generation part, and then after the plant shut down, it authorized certain discharges following termination of electricity generation. So obviously that's the period we're in now. The draft permit following termination of electricity authorizes chlorinated once through non-contact cooling water through outfall 001, non-thermal backwash water through outfall 002, chlorinated saltwater systems for the turbine building and reactor systems, cooling water systems through 010, internal outfall 011, which authorizes demineralizer reject water, station heating and service water systems. Outfall 012, which is chlorinated screen water backwash discharged to the canal. Outfall 014, which is wastewater from the waste neutralization pump, and then various yard and electrical vault stormwaters throughout the plant. The draft permit did not consider other types of new discharges, and any discharges not considered in the draft permit would have to get either another type of coverage under a permit, request a modification to this final permit, or not be allowed to be discharged to waters of the U.S. Once we issue the draft permit, it will become effective pending an appeal period, which is 30 days. If we get an appeal, then we will determine which parts of the permit may or may not be able to go into effect, and other provisions would be stayed pending the resolution of the appeal. In that case, the existing permit would remain in effect. Once the permit is finalized and effective, it will expire 5 years from the effective date. So I can take questions now, or I don't know.
They will be on.
At the end, or?
Mr. Papadopoulos, do you have anything you want to offer as part of this?
No, that covers it, but if there's any questions anyone has, clarification or anything.
Our usual practice is start from left to right, but does anyone have any questions? Pine?
Hi,
Hello.
it's nice to see you here.
Thank you.
Needless to say, it's hard to swallow the 5-year expiration thing when this is 24, 25, 26 years expired. it's also hard to swallow it when there are permit conditions that are not being followed. So, please say something that will help us understand how the permit will be a benefit to our work here at the NDCAP in terms of restoring the site to a safe and healthful condition. How are we waiting a couple of months for this way long overdue permit that is going to inspire us to a greater level of safety when nothing's been happening so far? Not enforcement, the draft came out in 2016, this is 3 years later. Now, I know we commented a lot, but we didn't mean to slow the process down. So is there a way that the public can assist the EPA in its due diligence to move this along and to issue a permit that is serviceable to the community?
The public comment period is closed, and I'm not here to take additional comments on the draft permit. So I think that really what the public needs to do is become familiar with, if they're not
No,
already.
you misunderstood my comment. My comment is not, how can the public comment? The question is, how can the EPA convince us that waiting for this long overdue permit is going to serve the community? Why is it so long overdue? What's the problem?
Well, Congress has brought up a lot of really challenging legal questions, technical questions, and so we kind of worked through those with the whole team.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Through
Any
the
other
chair-
questions? Yes,
Through the
Paul.
chair. I think I might be able to clarify. Of course, Ms. Dubois' point is excellent, okay? But I think Mr. Houlihan, what we've talked about in subcommittees, but we haven't talked about as a whole committee, is as to the history in the Commonwealth of Massachusetts and how in 1997, 1998, we as a Commonwealth went and negated all of the Npdes permits throughout the Commonwealth. And then we went and reviewed each of those permits, starting with the worst offenders first, okay? And that is why, okay, Pilgrim's permit wasn't finally approved until what seems like an interminable amount of time. But it is because of the process that was used in reviewing all the existing permits that were put on hold in 1997. Am I talking in generalities? I mean, you know it better than I, but Pilgrim was amongst the last to have to have had its permit renewed.
Well, I'm not familiar with, what may or may have not happened in 1998. Unfortunate, and we do have a large backlog of permits. This is not our only permit. We are working as hard as we can with our limited resources to update our Npdes permits. This permit was in fact brought to our attention as something that should be worked on, and we worked on it as best we could. Went through the process of issuing it as we're supposed to and holding public comment. This is where we are. I don't have anything to add.
And what I wanted to clarify is, I'm not being negative. What I'm saying is, I know, having been involved in the history of it, starting in '98, the EPA looked at the bad actors, the offenders first, the Salems, the Brayton Points.
Oh, right, yes, absolutely.
And that's why
A question
we
of-
don't get
yeah.
to Pilgrim till now.
Right, a question of priority, yes. That's absolutely true, that and I guess it was 1998, setting priorities. Brayton Point Station, as lots of folks know, was our #1 priority, and that was also a long overdue permit that went through extensive litigation. The plant is now actually closed. And so, yes, in terms of targeting and prioritizing, yes, there's a backlog, and that's how we got to where we are. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Before I give the floor to Senator Wolf, I have a couple of things. One is, I want to make sure you understand what the role of this panel is. Our charter is really pretty clear in the legislation. We're here to advise the governor and the legislature and other government officials as to what our collective thoughts are on things that could be done better for the decommissioning process. That's what we do. And I personally have quite a few questions I'm going to ask you, but I'd like Senator Wolf to go first.
I actually might want to hear yours first, Mr. Chairman.
Well, they might be better.
I'm just, I mean, just a quick editorial statement, because we met back when I was in the Senate a couple of times. And I guess what was curious to me, just for the edification of everybody here, is that the permit did not have to be updated, issued, reissued prior to the renewal of the operating license. When that all came up, I think it was 2012 or 13.
Well, except for that the NRC said it was supposed to.
Well, I know, Brian. I mean, you and I actually went to meetings together back then at EPA headquarters in Boston. So, you know, the relationship between two federal agencies here, I mean, we have been scratching our head around the relationship between state and federal agencies. But I think it's important for people to understand, this thing went through an extension of the operating license without an updated discharge permit.
Against all regulations.
Which was completely bizarre, I think, not only to those of us who were trying to get our hooks into this to stop it, but I actually think it was bizarre to the people at EPA as well. I mean, I don't want to speak for you guys, but the NRC just sort of went ahead and extended the license to operate without even having a up-to-date discharge permit, which, so I mean, if we think we're going to get any peace of mind at this point during decommissioning, remember what that was. That was a 20-year license extension without an EPA discharge permit being updated. And I think at that point it was more than 20 years, or around 20 years overdue, or it was 20 years old at that point. So just, sorry, that's not a question. I can inflect up at the end to make it a question. No.
Very helpful. Well, let me start with my first question, which we're delighted you're here, obviously. We appreciate you coming down and taking the time, and for the cooperation between the state. But it has been a long time in coming, and I know I've talked to Mr. Papadopoulos myself, and David, I know, has been working with his colleagues. But what brings you here tonight all of a sudden? What finally got this on the radar to move it forward? Did somebody, for example, Holtec, did they ask for it to move forward? I know the state's been working with you. What caused it finally to get up on a more of a priority list?
Right, it was with our work with the state that they made us aware of these meetings, and that we feel like we're getting to the end of our work, so it made sense to give this group an update of where we were. So that was the impetus for me coming down. I was invited.
And who is applying for the permit? How does that work for those of us that haven't had the history that Pine or the senator has?
Right.
Why don't you explain to us that process? Who applied for the permit? Who's applying for it now? Who will receive it and have to honor it if it's issued?
Okay, so I actually don't know who the owner was. When, was it Boston Edison?
Edison
When they actually applied.
applied for the permit back in 1995, 6.
Right.
Okay.
And then it was, the permit was transferred to Entergy, the current operator. Or I guess Holtec is now the current licensee. And so when the new permit is issued, it will reflect who the current licensee is.
Okay.
So, and I know that's in, you know, litigations.
And there's been a little bit of time. Did you want another question?
I do have, but I can wait.
Okay. There's been a little bit of time that's obviously elapsed since Edison applied for it. Has there been any enforcement activity in that period of time?
Not that I'm aware of, but I want to make clear, I don't work in the enforcement program,
Okay.
and I'm in the permitting program. So I don't know if there's been any enforcement. I imagine it would have been, if there was, it would have been a public, you know, announcement.
And does the permitting side take into consideration the enforcement side? Is that part of your process to see whether they have been in fact issued?
Yes, we do. Part of our process is to run the permit by the enforcement folks to make sure it is enforceable and identify, you know, any issues that they might have.
And has that been done to your knowledge in this one?
Oh, yes.
Okay, and they had no issues?
No.
And walk us through, for, you know, for, again, this period of time, exactly what the monitoring has been done by EPA on what's actually gone on there.
So all the monitoring is under the current permit.
Mhm.
So whatever effluent limits and conditions they were required to report on in their monthly discharge monitoring report is the monitoring that's ongoing.
So the monitoring is reporting from the owner
Yes, that's
to
consistent
EPA.
with. that's
There is
how-
no other monitoring that's been done.
No, not that I'm aware of, not
Okay.
from EPA's point of view.
From the state side?
No, sir, I'm not aware of additional monitoring either, except for that which is reported to the Nuclear Regulatory Commission.
Yeah.
Which is, we've discussed, is not subject to the NPDES permitting process.
Yeah. So just to make sure I understand, and I hope it helps with others that may not be much different than I, the period of time from when Edison first applied for the permit to the transfer, to the relicensing, to the new transfer to Holtec, there's been no outside monitoring of this to your knowledge at all, and the plant has not reported any problems during that time period.
What do you mean by problem? We've had violations of some.
Yeah, violations, have there been violations?
Been some.
And do you know what those are off the top of your head, or?
You know, they're probably enumerated in the fact sheet, discussion of different parameters of different samples.
Okay. Fine?
How is it gonna move forward if you're finished?
So Sean, I have a little bit of
Please.
additional information.
Yeah.
So Entergy submits a report, a discharge report, or they had historically, Holtec has not done that yet.
Up a little bit. I don't think they're
So
working.
historically, Entergy would file an annual discharge summary report to the NRC, and they CC, include on distribution, the US EPA and the Mass DEP. And that provides a summary of where they may have gone, like in and out of tolerance on an attribute of the permit. And then if you would go to the NRC's environmental monitoring site, you can review and see those reports to review if there were any gross violations or violations of the permit. So they're very detailed. They list out the attributes of the permit and how they performed against the permit.
So Jack, can I just clarify on that? Are you talking about radionuclide discharges? Are you talking about
I'm not, I'm talking about,
typical pollutants?
I'm talking about their, it's called the discharge monitoring report.
Right.
And it's with regards to the NPDES permit.
Right, and those reports do come to the agencies independent of NRC. That's an ongoing requirement of the permit to provide monthly operating reports,
Right.
basically
So-
DMRs.
That information is for members of the panel that are interested in that report. If you wanted to read one of those discharge reports, you can go to the NRC webpage and download that and read through and see what they report on an annual basis.
And, sorry, but Damien, that information is probably available through a EPA website, and I know they also make exceedance notifications in that.
It is. It's the ECHO database, which is available online. I don't have an address for that. But you can get discharge monitoring data for really any permittee is available to, it's public information.
Mr. Rothstein?
Okay. Thank you, Rich. For the edification of the panel, too, the panel should be aware, besides the daily monitoring of all of the discharge pathways, okay, and then there's the annual report, and then there's also an annual grab sample which verifies that the annual effluent report is indeed capable of detecting any of the effluents from the plant. And be advised, anytime there is a violation, just like on a ship, or just like on the canal plant, or just like in the Weymouth plants, okay, then if the violation is more than just a number, okay, more than just a single miss, but rather multiples or egregious, okay, then the state and the feds have auditors that come in and inspectors that investigate, as well as the site would put together a root cause analysis team and corrective action. And that was true of Boston Edison when they owned it, it was true of Entergy when they owned it, and I'm sure it's going to be true of the new owner, okay? And we should all be aware that's the standard of practice. So it's not just monitoring themselves, okay? And, oh, there's never a violation. And that's not true. It's like, as the Senator Wolf would be aware of, how the FAA monitors the airline industry. Rich?
I recall maybe about a half a dozen years ago or so, I think the only potential compliance issue that came up regarding anything related to an NPDES was a matter pertaining to the sludge processing or sludge drying beds at the plant for, I think, treating the wastewater discharges, not radiological per se, but human waste and wash sinks and toilets and things of that nature. And I believe this made the newspapers. Some of the regional environmental groups were concerned about that matter. I don't remember all the particulars. I believe, in fact, Dave Noyes, sitting in the audience, who was Entergy liaison reporting monthly to our Nuclear Matters Committee, came in and gave a discussion about what that was all about. And I think, I don't want to say it was much to do about nothing, but I think the issue kind of disappeared. But that's the only recollection I have as far as a potential NPDES issue in recent years.
Sean, I
Yeah.
can maybe add some information on that if you want me to.
Sure.
I think what Rich is talking about is there was an issue in the sludge from the sanitary waste wastewater treatment facility, which it relates to how Pilgrim manages their sanitary waste from the bathrooms and so forth through a wastewater treatment facility before it's discharged to the ground. So that's a Massachusetts only groundwater discharge permit, and it requires ongoing monitoring. It requires that they maintain the wastewater treatment facility. And there was a point in time when Pilgrim discovered that there was some very low-level radioactive detects in the sludge from the wastewater treatment facility. Pretty much every wastewater treatment facility generates sludge, and the sludge is either sampled for reuse or it's sampled for disposal. In the case of Pilgrim, when they were evaluating it for its ultimate disposition, they made this discovery. It was further evaluated, and they concluded that, and we actually, Mass DEP went out and inspected the facility. We sent a team of inspectors out to look around to see if we could find anything that could be potentially coming from the facility that shouldn't go into the sanitary wastewater flow, to look for a potential source of radionuclide contamination. We didn't find any, Pilgrim didn't find any, and the evaluation led us to conclude that the levels were so low that they were likely throughput through the human bodies that were relying on this facility, either from body burden, from various exposures we all have, people that work at Pilgrim particularly more so maybe, and also medical exposures, so that you can find that. And as I understand it, Pilgrim has henceforth always sent out the sludge from the wastewater treatment facility, the sanitary wastewater treatment facility related to the groundwater discharge permit, always sends that sludge out as a low-level rad waste.
Pat?
Thanks for coming tonight. Had a couple quick questions. I didn't realize that the permits were delayed that long. I thought it was only a couple of years. But anyway, so you're saying that these permits are being made out to Holtec now? And Entergy never really had a permit, or was there a permit in place that they were working from?
Yeah, there was a permit in place, and there still is, in fact, a permit in place.
Which is about 20 years.
Right, which is the old permit, which we're looking to update with the new permit, which will reflect the current licensee.
And they would be under the Holtec, right?
I presume so. I don't know the status of the litigation and when all that's going to happen, so I think it might be a bit of a timing thing, but the current licensee would be the permittee.
And then you mentioned a whole bunch of outfalls. Are they listed on the website, would show where the map is, where
Yep,
they're
they are.
located and stuff?
And,
'Cause I have no idea.
I don't know, Dave, maybe the best thing would be for me to get you the website address, and you can circulate it to the members. And so there's a whole page actually devoted to the Pilgrim Power Plant, and when you click on the documents, the most pertinent for background information is the fact sheet that accompany the draft permit, and that will show, all, like I just mentioned, all the outfalls and the flows and the diagrams.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Hein?
So, the draft permit that was in 2016, it had two parts to it, basically. One with it operating at an intake of 480 million gallons of water per day with a discharge. And since it shut down on May 31st, it reduced, I think we've had some discussions along these lines, to 3 million gallons a day?
It's 3,200 gallons a minute. We have one seawater pump. I think that roughly comes out to around 4 million gallons.
4 million gallons a day. So your permit, I would think, would be simplified considerably to address only the current use of seawater to cool and release contaminants to the environment that our understanding is going to go on until 2023,
Yeah, roughly.
roughly 2023. Will the permit also include the sort of any license, any permit, any discharge that will be asked for, I guess? I mean, it's been a long time since I read the application relative to the decontamination, the decommissioning. Because when the permit was asked for renewal, Entergy was thinking, 60 years from now, we're going to decommission this place. All we're going to do is store some spent fuel here. Everything's going to go to sleep, boom, done. So can you help us understand now, in a couple of months, we'll see a permit that, that wraps its arms around just the 4 million gallon a day intake and release of heat and whatever is in the pipes, I suppose. What about the stormwater in a situation where we are undergoing massive construction, digging out things that are contaminated, have already a lot of stormwater drains, some of which go to the discharge canal and some of which don't. They go to the intake area. Have you wrapped your arms around that yet? Is there, is there an update in the application? Is there anything that's going to help you deliver a permit that is meaningful for these next 10 years that Holtec says we're going to be all done by 2028?
Yeah, sounds
If
right.
everything goes
Sounds
well,
right. 8 years. It sounds right. Yeah.
something like that.
Yeah.
So in other words, can you write a permit that's going to address the decommissioning activities and we don't have to go back and ask you again for another one in 5 years, but it's really going to be enforceable, right, Dave? It's really going to be enforceable, and it's really going to be relevant and helpful. I mean, I looked at my letter right now, and we said we found 33,000 violations. We don't want that anymore. We don't want that kind of level of, we don't, they're not going to do anything anyway, so, we don't have to fix that pipe kind of thing. So can you help me understand the scope? I guess that's what I'm asking.
Yeah, I can try. So the draft permit was based on the decommissioning proposed at the time, which is safe store. And so any changes or deviations from that would require that the permittee make those discharges known and characterized, and then they would have to apply for either additional coverage from a different permit or seek a modification to the permit.
So that's the question. So is there a streamlined path for these guys to update EPA on how the plans have changed since they decided to, close it down in May and now can I say flip it without insulting anybody? Sell it to another company who can do the job of decommissioning? Fast,
Even more to the point,
sorry.
even more to the point, so what I thought I heard you say was the permit application that you're currently working on closure for was for Safe Store,
That's right.
Yeah, see, that's a
but
problem.
that's not what they're doing.
That's a problem.
Right, so they're gonna have to stay within the confines of the permit as written.
That's a little troubling.
So,
In other words, until we get additional information regarding,
so why are you finishing a permit that's not applicable to the plant?
Can I jump in here and see if I go astray? I think it's important that we recognize that what this permit has to do with is effluent. So it's a permit for discharging pollutants to the waters of the Commonwealth. And that's evaluated, and we determine what the safe levels are of those pollutants. We set limits for it, and we establish a monitoring requirement for it, and then establish a reporting requirement for it. That's how we do it. It does not, so when you talk about decommissioning, and we talk about the fact that the permit is based on Safe Store, the permit is based on the application. The application currently presents Safe Store. So that's what the permit does. The permit responds to the application. When new information comes available, that activities out there would result in a change in the character of the effluent, then before that effluent character can change, or other sources of pollution are released to the waters of the Commonwealth, there would need to be a new permit or a modification of this permit. So the permit doesn't address activities that don't result in a change in effluent. Now, correctly, folks have pointed out that construction activities, disruption and so forth, can change the nature of the effluent. And, and Holtec or whomever is going to need to be cognizant of that. This permit allows discharge into the effluent that is related to, operation of the plant, cooling water, other sources of discharge related to current condition stormwater. So if any of their activities are going to change the nature of that effluent, then this permit is not adequate to manage that, and they'll have to come back.
So what I hear you saying, I think, DJ, is that the activity itself is constrained by the requirements that are listed in the permit, not necessarily the title of the process.
The activity isn't limited. The results on the discharge of pollutants to the effluent is what is limited. So if an activity is going to have, if an activity will cause a change in the discharge of pollutants to the effluent, that is not going to be allowed in the permit. That's a time when the permittee will need to identify that and determine if it's covered by the permit. You're hearing that probably not. And they'll have to identify if there's a potential of that pollution going into the effluent. They'll have to either seek a new permit or more likely modify their current permit.
Thank you.
Let me ask one question first, Rick. Now, I've heard some very interesting stuff. So what is the difference between the requirements of the permit for Safe Store versus decommissioning?
Well, decommission, I believe, is the broad term that includes Safe Store or decon, is that?
No, it's
No,
very,
that's
very
correct.
different.
What he just said is correct. Decon and Safe Store are forms of decommissioning.
I understand that, but we're decommissioning. Holtec's going to decommission the plant.
Right.
They're gonna bring it down to the soil. They're gonna return it, hopefully. So what would be the differences in your permitting for those two? Because if they applied for it under Safe Store, which it's not,
Right.
what's the difference under what they're doing now?
I won't know until they put those forward.
And
So-
to answer you just
Yeah.
in a broad sense, the first 2.5 years of the plan for decon or for Safe Store,
Yeah,
under
same.
both plans, basically you're just doing cooling the fuel. It's the same
It's the
in
same.
that sense for the first 2.5 years. Now, we'll bring back what we're hearing tonight to our team and talk about them to be mindful of any changes during the deconstruction portion of the decommissioning.
Well, that helps get me to my second question is,
Sean, before you get to the next question, can I try to add a little bit to the answer on, response for that, that question? So kind of give an example. If Safe Store involves mothballing and nothing more theoretically, and if decommissioning involves deconstruction of the plant ultimately, theoretically now, decommissioning could involve emptying out buildings, any number of activities that won't result in a change to the nature of the pollutants entering the effluent we're permitting. That could move forward under this permit. But if, as an example, they wanted to deconstruct a building, they wanted to do some activity, dewater an excavation into the effluent discharge, that's not covered by what we are anticipating here. That would mean identify it, characterize it, determine, how that would need to get permitted. Is it NRC? Is it EPA, DEP, Npdes permit? And seek a modification of the permit, or a new permit, but likely a modification.
so that does bring me to the second part of it. Are there things that may occur after the 2.5 year period that will require either a modification or a new permit? Do we have any experience in this? Do we know?
This discharge is different than what's currently authorized by the upcoming final permit, then we have to address it as a modification.
Right, so
Yeah.
that
And-
would be up
okay.
to the plant.
So it would be up to the owner of the plant
Yes,
rather than up to EPA or DEP?
yes.
Okay, because there's no monitoring to determine, has something been disrupted that might get into the effluent? I got that. So if that's the case, can they proceed without the modification or a new permit being issued?
Proceed
With the full deconstruction of the site and restoring it to its,
under the current permit?
yeah.
I would say no.
So they would have to file a new permit or a modification?
Yeah, so that's the whole, I guess, maybe this is a fine point that I didn't bring out. They cannot modify their current permit.
Yep,
It's expired, so that's not allowed. So that's why we're reissuing it. So under a reissued permit, they would be able to then go and seek a modification. Or, again, there may be an alternative way to get these waste streams covered through either a general permit, hauling the waste off-site. I don't know if, ground injection is a possibility, but that's,
And if they did seek to have a groundwater injection, they would need to get a groundwater discharge permit if they're proposing any, introduction of pollutants into the groundwater as a Commonwealth. That would need a permit.
Can't go into the center of the earth maybe, but not.
Pat?
I was gonna say, in regards to the revisions, what kind of time are you talking about? Couple of months, a couple of years? 10 years?
to make a revision?
Yeah.
Well, it could be a lengthy process because typically a modification to a permit, unless it's what we call a minor modification, which is pretty limited, that would require a draft permit modification, the public notice, comment period, response to comment period, probably a public hearing. That's the process that a modification is very similar to issuing a new permit.
Richard?
I want to thank David for his quantitative recollection to my qualitative recollection about the sludge bed situation and what really was happening. But that begets a regulatory question. I'm not sure who to direct it to, whether our guests or to some of the people on our panel who have knowledge about this issue. What happens if during routine monitoring during decommissioning, if some radionuclides are uncovered or discovered in the effluent that exceeds what the state would consider to be a de minimis level such that it can't be ignored? and it has to be dealt with in terms of the licensee modifying their decommissioning method or methodology, or even maybe being outside of any enforcement, whether it's an NRC enforcement, an EPA, or even the state, even though the permit may be for non-radionuclide discharges. So I'm just trying to wrap my hands, or my head, I should say, around what happens if, because it could happen during decommissioning.
Jack, did you want to say something?
I can talk about the radionuclide part. So as we said previously, this permit, the NPDES permit, is not for radionuclides. So the example that Rich just gave, they're doing an excavation, they found some contamination. The contamination is in water, and that water is going to be directed to an outfall, which is an effluent pathway. Those effluents are regulated by the NRC. My glasses on, I was writing some notes. So Part 50 are the tech specs on effluents, and 5036A, they have a couple of reg guides for how they would calculate that. They have reg guides and requirements on what type of monitoring needs to be in the pipe that would move the water to the effluent outfall to do that. That is not the DPH that does that. That's not the DEP that does that monitors that. Those requirements are solely under purview of the NRC.
And through the chair to
Yes, please.
clarify what the good Mr. Jack says, liquid discharges are not normal, okay? They're batched, okay? So a liquid red waste discharge would first be in a tank, it'd be recirculated, it would be sampled, and then it would be checked against, as Jack points out, 10 CFR 5036 alpha, has to be within those limits before it's discharged. Okay, so it's not a case of the normal circ water pump running and you find a radionuclide in it. This is something that's known beforehand. They're batch releases.
Right, so you remember when Bill Irwin from Vermont came up and they talked about groundwater in leakage into the
Yep.
basement? Remember what they had to do? They had to take that water, they had to put it into tanks and then assess it, dilute it, measure it before it could go out an effluent pathway, or they decided to dispose of that, some of that water as well. So that would be a similar process that would be done here, and that is not part of the NPDES permitting.
David?
Yeah, I guess, we've been talking a lot about effluent sources and monitoring in different pipes, and the water gets into the pipe, and then it gets monitored, and you can tell if there's a violation, but you probably can't put a giant tarp over the site, and it rains. And so as you're involved in this construction or deconstruction process, and it rains, how are you assuring that just rain runoff doesn't go into the bay with whatever contaminants are in the soil when it rains? I mean, all of that isn't going to naturally migrate into a pipe. Water goes everywhere. So if you're only looking at the pipes and you've got a construction site that at some point is just going to be moving dirt around, how are you assured? Is there any state or federal authority that looks at how to prevent stormwater runoff into the bay as a result of the deconstruction activity?
So this permit doesn't. We do have stormwater that goes into the electrical vaults, but that's not the type of, from construction-related activity. So this permit does not address that. So they could not discharge that type of stormwater under this permit.
Well, I know, but it rains, right? Like, so is there a separate permit that,
They would need to
Yes.
get.
and a separate agency that governs that, or a
Well,
separate
the construction
division?
general permit is run by EPA, so it's still a federal permit.
Okay.
So they would need that.
So can you tell us the status of that permit?
I cannot.
Is that a separate agency within the EPA or separate division within the
Yeah, but it's a
EPA?
separate section that does the
What do you mean by
construction.
the status of that?
Well, is there a construction permit that will show how they're going to prevent, or at least how you're going to monitor stormwater runoff as a result of construction?
I don't think that applied for construction general.
It's permit, it's available in the case of.
So I don't want to step on Holtec, but I have other facilities that we have decommissioned in the state that had radioactive material. I'm only speaking about radioactive material. So for those, it's the general contractor that works through the permitting, that might have wetland protection requirements that are in there to make and address those as part of the plan, as part of the contingency when they do that type of construction. And I'll let Holtec
Yeah, no,
embellish
that's
that.
accurate, and that's very similar to what we just went through with the Conservation Commission in Plymouth which I'll talk about later in my report, to get the haul path permitted. There was a wetland resource close enough, so we went through mitigating actions and went for a waiver request on that particular one. So we'll be going through all that permitting throughout the entire process.
So how do you monitor, just a section in the bay where we've had a big rainstorm and there's a runoff into the bay just down the hill? Are you looking at what's going through that into the bay?
I can speak to that. for
Radionuclide
what they're
or
doing right now.
non-radionuclide,
So I
right.
can speak, I'm only speaking
yeah.
for the radionuclide part.
Right.
Right, so the Department of Public Health with the owner-operator does monitor. They take grab samples, we do split samples, they have it, a private accredited laboratory analyze those samples, and the Department of Public Health does a percentage of those as well.
Okay.
They are not real-time.
Right, sure.
They're after the fact monitoring, but there's other, on other projects, we have used real-time monitoring to monitor like a drainage ditch or an X foundation that would fill with water, to ensure if there was any leak off from that we knew that there was material in the water, and then we could address how would we mitigate it and preclude it from going down an unauthorized pathway.
Okay. And is there a state agency that's looking at non-radionuclide contamination?
That would be my Department of Environmental Protection in conjunction with EPA with regard to the Npdes permit.
Right. What about the stormwater permits?
So the stormwater permits would be, as Damien said, would be partly included within a construction general permit for any activity over an acre that was subject to that general permitting. They would have details, as the gentleman said there, and how that would operate. Activities related to or within Wetlands Protection Act jurisdiction would also need to be detailed and go before Conservation Commission, and if it were appealed, go before DEP. So there's a couple of layers there, as well as my understanding is that there is stormwater from a portion of the site being directed to the effluent, some of the outfalls as well. And they would have monitoring requirements and, if necessary, treatment requirements as well.
So Dave and Pine, you'd ask, okay, so what should the panel ask about that? Okay, so there has to be a permitting and a plan and a construction plan. The question that we should be asking, we'll take it that those are gonna be in place and they're gonna follow those very specific rules. So you asked, how do you monitor it? The questions we should be asking to Holtec or the owner-operator is, what are your plans for that? Are they robust enough to support a large site and the type of monitoring that you're going to do? And
Yes.
We don't have that level of detail yet.
Okay.
And I don't have that available at my fingertips, but that's something I'm writing down right now.
I think that in the end, it's just reassuring to know that there is a process to look at that, to make sure that there's appropriate plans in place to mitigate stormwater runoff, and that somebody's keeping an eye at a state level on what, if anything, is resulting from that.
So again, Vermont, with a different contractor, North Star, that their general plans were laid out with things like milestones. So back to the NPDES, where they said, hey, we can use the current revised plan for the first 2 years, because basically you're in wet layup and you're cooling the fuel off, and then as you change to, okay, now we're gonna start draining systems, components, deconstruction work, they'll have to apply for that. That's what North Star laid out with milestones, so they knew in advance. They wouldn't run up the clock to the goal line and say, oh boy, now we need to go get a permit, and now it's gonna take me 2 years to get a extension. I'm making that number up.
Yeah, I get it. Very helpful, thank you.
Any other questions on the panel?
And one other comment, please. The original permit didn't have any kind of stormwater provisions, but this draft permit 2016 does have a stormwater pollution prevention plan.
Okay.
Which kind of addresses, housekeeping type of issues to limit kind of runoff from pollutants.
Okay.
Very softball. It's not going to affect it until the permit goes into
Right.
effect.
Thank you.
Any other questions from the panel?
Can I ask Coltech something?
Sure.
Can you give us a schedule at some time in the near future for applying for this general permit and the Conservation Commission work?
Yeah.
Having just gone through a
Yeah, no,
construction
trust me.
project, I know how hard
I
it is
still have
to
my
contain
wounds.
things.
Yeah.
And I think there needs to be a really great, robust system in place for doing that. And can you update the panel on the measures you're taking in order to do that, so that we know how the decommissioning is going to proceed?
Yeah.
Both in the regulatory framework and in just a practical kind of, get the job done framework.
Not a problem. I'll bring that back. I think that's something, that can be done. Understanding that I think North Star's obviously ahead of us. All the fuel was
Yeah.
on pad when they took over
Right.
in January, so they're 2.5 years probably ahead of us, so.
I think it would be useful for the panel to have, we had an original discussion with some high-level milestones, assuming that things were proceeding separate from the legalese that's going right now. Coming back to us with a major milestone of how this is going to be sequenced would be useful to the panel.
If I could just add before we thank our guests for joining us. Brian Sullivan and I had a couple of conversations over the last month, and perhaps we'll see some of it tonight. Based on the comments from the panel at the last meeting, there was a general sense that we need a bit more granularity in terms of how to understand exactly what Holtec's working on. And Brian and I talked about their internal methodology. I'm familiar with, and some of you may be, Microsoft Project. It's a pretty commonly used project management tool. It's not as high level or sophisticated, I'm sure, as what Holtec's going to use. But Brian and I went through this, and we had agreed that prior to the change of the meeting, he would be here. And what we were going to see, he said, was a much more typical project management plan, where you would have what the tasks are, what the resource required, what the start date was, what the predecessors were, what some of the risk factors were, at a high level. We're not getting down to, well, there'll be 7 guys working on this, but at a high level. And that's what he agreed. It sounds like what we're all saying here is that that's what we would like to see, not just for 2 years out on the permitting, but where are we today?
Yeah.
And we'll see what.
Well, I was just gonna say, I wish he shared that with me, because that's not what what he
Well, then
shared with
there-
me. And he actually reviewed my slides, so now
There'll be a level of disappointment
No,
that I'll express at the end of it.
but I understand now what you're looking for, so at
Yeah,
the next meeting,
and
I
I
can
could
put
give
it,
you-
yeah.
If you
Quotes,
guys could
because-
make that
Yeah, no,
commitment for the next meeting, because we
Yeah.
have a break in December, and
Yeah.
that could allow us to
Extra
review that
time.
with some of these
Yeah.
other concerns we have to see.
So we're
where they
looking
fit
high-level
into-
milestones and
Well,
resourcing.
no, he
And
actually went
resourcing.
through, you guys have different levels by letter.
He wants a piece of it.
What's an A level, what's a B level, what's a C level? And he identified the levels that he would be prepared to bring forward.
Okay.
So,
I'll have that discussion with him when he gets back from Camden.
Yeah, and Patrick, along the same lines, I mean, to the extent that you can be forward-looking as well, I mean, I think in the ideal, where, we see what starts, we see how it progresses every month, and then we have you look in the crystal ball for what's coming. And the advantage of that is that, if we're flagging things for which you ought to be seeking a permit modification, that's technical guidance we can provide.
No, absolutely, I appreciate that.
For all of our agencies.
any other questions for our guests? In that case, thank you very, very much for attending. We appreciate it. Yes, Jim?
Instead of leaving, could the public have an opportunity to ask 1 or 2 quick questions of it?
I'd love to do that, provided that it's only 1 or 2 quick questions. Okay, we'll allow 3 questions, just not to be, yeah.
Basically, from what we've heard tonight, it's quite clear that the permit will be issued sometime in the near future. Will cover what you're gonna do until you actually get into demolition plan. Also seems to be quite clear that once that happens, the the affluence will exceed what is going to be in that permit. The question is quite simple. When you learn, and I grant you, you're not getting real time, so you have to count on them to give you the information, that their affluents exceed the level of the permit you're about to issue, are they permitted just to continue for the next 25 years until it gets you a modification, or does somebody issue what I used to call a stop order?
Yes, they would not be allowed to, violate the permit, discharge effluent that's not in accordance with the permit. It's just simply not allowed, so.
Who enforces that?
That would be our enforcement
So if
division,
it
yeah.
came to your attention, you would enforce them, of course, when you stop those activities.
Right, except for, you understand I'm in the permitting program, and that enforcement is by EPA. Yes, it's EPA purview, yep.
Thank you. Thank you again. Oh, is there one person? Go ahead. I'm sorry, Henrietta, go ahead.
One other question.
Yep.
Given that COMCON just gave the permit for the haul path, I wanted really to address the question to Holtec. I think I asked last week if you were quite certain that there's no contamination in the area which is going to be disrupted for the expansion of the haul path. And
Well, I said as part of that, we'll be taking sampling along the way.
you will be
Yes.
taking sampling
Yep.
along the way.
Yep.
And supposing it is more contaminated than you anticipate, will you be prepared to have a plan to make sure that that contamination doesn't exceed the permit that you will soon have?
It's different projects, but they're
Yeah,
talking,
but the disruption
I
is
understand what
very
you're saying.
close to
It's-
very close to the day, so I'm just wondering how
I
this.
understand,
what
I understand what you're saying, but yes, if we identify something, we would put a plan together to remediate it.
Does the EPA take samples? DPA takes samples.
We
Will
do not.
anybody besides Holtec?
We do not.
No?
So.
Thank you, Henry.
So with that, I'll just say, I'm not making a policy statement. In the past, we had a cooperative agreement with Entergy. If they were outside of their fence line and they identified radioactive materials, we would, as we did with the tritium project, we collectively got together, we came up with a sampling plan and agreed upon how we would do that, so. Historically, we've entered into cooperative agreements with the owner and operator if radioactivity was identified outside of normal areas. For that pathway, based on my knowledge now, that's not a high probability where that haul path is being constructed. But in the future, as we get into other areas on site on that project, I would expect that same level of cooperation between the Department of Public Health Radiation Control Program and the Health Physics Radiation Safety section of Holtec.
Thank you.
But again, that's the discussions that we're working on now with the new owner.
Thank you, gentlemen. Very much appreciated.
Thank you.
Our next agenda item, Pat alluded to it a moment ago. Pat, you're on.
Yeah, I asked my colleague to run my slideshow since I forgot my little clicker. And again, I apologize, Sean, I wish I knew that conversation between you and Brian, because I would have heard my slides.
Yeah.
Rich's mic is the only one that's working.
You want to hand me that, Rich? I'll try to yell, too. All right. Yeah, I'll try, all right. Is that better, hopefully? I can't without dragging the wires.
Yeah. Well, just put it on the podium and just go stand at the podium and do your presentation.
That's a good idea.
Try not to.
Common sense prevails again.
Sorry.
Didn't mean to jump on your.
No, that's,
Where'd that come
hope that's the right one.
All right. So thank you, fellow panel members. Provide a brief update on the activity since the last. Joyce? next one. So just a quick agenda. Last meeting, one of the questions Mr. Grassi had for me was, how does the PSDAR line up with what I was reporting back to the committee? So I have a quick little overview on what was in the PSDAR, and kind of, I'll speak a little bit to how that, what I presented last time meets up to that and how I'll do that going forward. An update on the asphyxia pad, an update on governmental interactions, and then I addressed the questions that I had written down from the last NDCAP, and try to plan to do that going forward in all these updates. Next slide. So I know this is probably a little hard to see. I'll send around the thing, the slide deck to the chair and the committee. But this is right out of the PSDAR, the next 3 slides, what we're working on in this initial phase 1 period. It's a lot of planning, stakeholder interaction, procurement of services, supplies, the historical site reviews, the planning for the site characterization, the ALARA budget, as low as reasonably achievable related to dose, waste management plans, safety, security, environmental studies, reactor vessel internals and reactor pressure vessel segmentation, tooling and design and planning, and then licensing and permitting actions as necessary. Next slide, Joyce. So right out of the PSDAR, we finalized that organization. We've integrated that organization between the original CDI planning staff and the former Npdes employees. Did our staffing and configuration, where we are with the workload at the site. And then we've reviewed and implemented the policies, programs, procedures that come over from Npdes into the Holtec CDI brand. Next slide, Joyce. So we've worked on, and John can speak to this a little bit if necessary, but we've developed work packages of what we're looking at and what we're doing in this initial phase. The site characterization is going out to bid next month, and I'll have a little bit more on that later in the slides. And then we're working on, which is a key part of the decommissioning, those transportation and disposal contracts. Next slide. More. So on the update on the asphyxia pad, we did meet with the Conservation Commission on October 15th. We did get a letter of support from Senator DiMacedo and Rep. Muratori for the need for the waiver on the project. We presented, that waiver request. Work is adjacent to a small spring stream located along the discharge canal. The waiver was thankfully approved, and I give a lot of credit and really a lot of appreciation to Ms. Dubois for coming and supporting. I think she understood the project better than most and was able to help. So we are recommencing work on the upper pad by the end of the month, and we're in that process to construct the second pad. Governmental interactions, myself and the new EP manager did meet with the reception towns at the monthly MEMA meeting on the 10th. We are scheduled, or I'm scheduled, to present to the Plymouth Board of Selectmen next Tuesday night. I think I have 45 minutes on the agenda, John, roughly.
Talk to that guy.
Oh, yeah, okay, all right. We've begun initial meetings with EPZ and reception town members. I met with Taunton today, which was the first, and I have Kingston, Bridgewater scheduled, and I need to get dates firmed up with Duxbury and Carver and Marshfield. Next slide. Met with the MEMA director yesterday and her staff, just general issues related to emergency planning. I don't know if you have any comments on our meeting, but just throwing it out there. And then the next big thing coming down the pike, the DOE Office of Waste Management is visiting Massachusetts the week of November 4th. They're doing an on-site visit on the 5th. They're meeting with the railroad owners on the 6th. And they have requests to meet with the chair and vice chair of the NDCAP on the 7th. And I did reach out, and I haven't connected with you, Ken, but they would like to meet with you on the 7th as well, if possible. It's a group of about 25 individuals from federal government, Federal Railroad, Department of Energy. They're tasked with, there's a report that every nuclear plant that is shut down has a section in this report where they look at what's the potential pathways to remove fuel from a site should the DOE get around to taking the fuel as they are obligated to. So this will be their time to look at what Pilgrim has and figure out that part of the report. I think they're updating the report this year to include Oyster Creek and Pilgrim. And then just as a follow-up from the last NDCAP meeting, I was asked how long the haul path is. It's approximately a half a mile, according to the project team. So as I said, the site characterization study was a question. It hasn't gone out to bid yet. It's going out to bid in November. What I'm committing and trying to work through is making sure that anything that's non-proprietary, and I put that in there not knowing if anything would even be proprietary in it, but I would like to work to have that as publicly available. You know, my logic behind that is that, you know, Holtec is here to clean up the site. What we find in that study isn't something that Holtec put there, but we're there to clean it up. So working through that, and I'll have more information obviously in the future as we go through that. And then Rich had asked about the potential for the fuel going to New Mexico for the proposed site. I don't have a timeframe on when we would be staged in that. Obviously, as a Holtec facility, I would assume we would have some preference over any other potential fuel sites, but the schedule I have is the earliest, if everything's stuck to the schedule that's been laid out, the earliest that facility would be completed would be 2024, and that would be, you know, the earliest that any fuel from anywhere could be accepted, so.
Pat, before you come off that
Oh,
slide,
sorry, yep.
what in a site characterization could be proprietary?
That's what I said, I don't know. I don't have that answer, but that's why I wanted to check, since we haven't gone out to bid yet. I don't know what's gonna be in there, so that was more of a caveat statement. I don't, for probably the same perspective as you, I don't foresee anything that would be, but I just wanted to at least lay that out there if there was something that had to be held.
Since there's not a meeting in December, we probably wouldn't have that information until January.
On when?
Once-
Because
once
the
it's gone
study
out to
itself's
bid.
about 6 months, is what I was told.
Right, but we'll know who was the award winner and what product they're gonna
I would
provide.
say yes to January, but having seen how slow we move procurement-wise so far, I'd struggle to commit to that. But I would say first quarter of 2020.
Well, in January, if you don't have the bid back, at least we could see you did a request for proposal.
Oh, no, I'm sorry, I take that back. Yeah, we would have bid out by then. I don't know if we would have awarded it by then. That's where I was going with that. Sorry, Jack. And that's all I have for an update. Yeah,
Let's-
sorry.
Rich,
Yeah, Rich.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Sean, Patrick, please. The site characterization study, is that going to be a public document?
That's what we were just talking about.
No, you were just talking about proprietary, I thought.
No, what I said
Information
is I'm working to make sure that whatever we get for a site characterization study is able to be provided publicly.
And is that an RFP that you prepare?
Yes.
Do you do it in accordance with NRC requirements?
I think we do everything in accordance with NRC
So
requirements.
there's a reference that you
There are
would
no,
give us?
there
But I
are
don't-
no
yeah.
there are
Yeah.
no requirements.
That's what I want to
Yeah.
know.
That's why I asked about the request for proposal,
Yeah.
because that would have a scope, and then we could look at the scope and say, is that scope
Yeah.
adequate to answer the questions that we.
Is it a request for scope or a price, or is it a request for proposal?
I'd have to double check on that. I don't have that offhand, Rich. I know we're in process.
Through the chair, perhaps this is
Yeah,
a question
go
better
ahead.
answered by Mr. Johnson. Would that site survey include toxins, not just radionuclides, right? This is a
Multi-hazard
Yeah.
review.
So we might be pressuring poor Mr. Patrick, he won't have results.
No,
we
yeah,
asked
you're right,
for
Jack, yeah.
results,
Results is probably at least 6 months from when they start the work.
Yeah, Paul, I was looking for what's the scope
Scope.
of work that we're gonna look at.
And Paul, the question needs to be directed to Holtec. What, we're not telling them what their scope is for their site assessment. We certainly have interest in what that is, and we have very strong opinions relative to what that should be. But it's up to Holtec to come up with that, and ideally, like Jack has mentioned, make it available, share it, get input, so that the final product is a good, comprehensive radionuclide, non-radionuclide site evaluation.
That was the point I was trying to make. Thank you, Mr. Johnson, because it is like asbestos or hydrocarbons, or it is more than a single discipline, more than a single state agency. Thank you.
Rich?
Thanks a lot. Will the say that, you said 6 months for the site characterization study approximately.
That's what I've been
That
told.
will be bid, or that would be expected.
That's what I've been told from when we
So
would
6
pick
months
someone.
from, say, December or January, whatever that date is,
Mm-hmm.
you'll get a better understanding of what the site characterization really is.
Correct.
And will you be doing an updated PSCAR and an updated cost estimate as a result?
That's a good question. I would assume so if there are things that are unanticipated in there.
Because without a
But I'll bring
site
that question back.
characterization study, how can you know that those numbers are?
There's historical spill data, so there's things that have been factored in that, with the material that we did get from
Sure.
Entergy, so. But yeah, anything that is obviously unforeseen that is in that would have to be mitigated and dealt with accordingly.
Senator?
I'm kind of curious, I think this goes both to the state agencies or possibly David, but I'm curious as to what level the state is going to be overseeing relative to the qualifications and training of the people doing the work, and also the quality control. I know the NRC has a role in that, but as time goes on, the NRC has less of a role. I guess I'm kind of curious, is the interagency working group starting to plan what that's going to look like?
I think you're getting into areas that are the sorts of topics that are under discussion with Holtec. I think Holtec is in a better position to answer those right now. You know, as I just mentioned, you know, we have opinions relative to what these assessments ought to look like and, you know, who ought to be, how they're done by a qualified individual. So we have opinions on that, certainly, and that's, you know, but I think you got to talk to Holtec relative to, you know, where they're heading right now.
Yeah, I think my answer to that is there's a finite number of people, I think, in the country that can do this type of work, and, you know, I think we'd be picking from a known entity. But I'll take that back and I'll see what I can figure out, 'cause I don't.
Mr. Chairman, can I just follow
Yeah,
up?
absolutely.
You know, again, you sort of heard me say the elephant, the peanuts last time. I think you like that.
I did.
With all due love and trust and respect and everything, we got to remember, Holtec is here ultimately for the return of investment and profit for the shareholders. The state is here to oversee the safety and the quality of the decommissioning, as well as the quality of site restoration and what we're left with at the end. So, I mean, I love the fact that, you know, we're going to be talking to Holtec about this, but there's absolutely a role as the NRC lets go relative to its regulatory oversight for various agencies to make sure that the qualifications of the people actually hands-on doing the work and the quality control is monitored as the work proceeds, which goes beyond simply a question and response to the Holtec. And again, as Paul points out, I run a highly regulated company, so I understand the degree to which, you know, there is a responsibility of the operator and the business, but also the responsibility on behalf of the public relative to the state agency. And please don't read into this anything negative. At this point, I'm just curious as to how that interaction is going to go at a state level, since we really aren't conversing with the NRC.
Can I answer that, attempt to answer it? You know, I really am not, as we've talked about so many times, at liberty to disclose the details of the discussions, you know, ongoing with Holtec relative to how we would prefer to come to a mutually agreeable settlement or agreement with Holtec moving forward, so these questions are answered in a way that is transparent and mutually agreed upon. So I can't answer that, but what I can do is if folks have any questions, or I can maybe provide a bit of an overview of kind of how our systems work. And, you know, like DPH and Jack, MassDP has a lot, and like EPA, MassDP has a lot of different oversight areas. So MassDP regulates the generation, storage, transportation, disposal of hazardous waste, non-radionucleide contaminated hazardous waste. If it is radionuclide contaminated, NRC has the jurisdiction until it is clear, essentially no longer represents a level that creates a concern for them, and then it falls back to us. So as part of that, we have the right to inspect. We do inspect. We have inspected Pilgrim. And we track, and all these wastes are tracked cradle to grave through an EPA, DEP tracking system. So that's one area of oversight. We also have, under our air quality requirements, specific requirements for survey of buildings that are going to be demolished to determine if they contain asbestos material. And if they do, and there's going to be work that would disrupt the asbestos, then we have requirements for notification and receiving an approval or an okay to move forward, or in this case, more likely, a specific permit for an abatement of asbestos. So we have that oversight role. We also have solid waste requirements. And solid waste requirements come into play not related to radionuclide contamination, simply debris. So when debris is generated, and we have the oversight authority for how that debris is managed. And what we need, what we don't allow is disposal of the debris. So solid waste debris has to be properly managed for either off-site disposal, on-site reuse, or off-site reuse with specific permits, and in some cases based on meeting some performance criteria, and that's solid waste. So we also, solid waste, and then we have hazardous waste, which is kind of what we're touching upon right now, I think, is the site assessment. Theoretically, a site assessment would touch on all this. And specific to releases, which Patrick mentioned, releases of oil hazardous material, the way that program works, it's a semi-privatized program is how we refer to it. And it requires that licensed site professionals oversee the cleanup. And the way DEP becomes involved in that oversight requirement for us is that when either a reportable quantity or a release occurs, or there's discovery of a reportable concentration of an oil or hazardous material that is listed, and there's hundreds of them that are listed in our requirements, then it is incumbent on the property owner, the potentially responsible party. There's 5 categories, including property owner, transporter, and so forth, to notify us. And at that point, they fall into our oversight system, and there's specific requirements for how they evaluate and assess and ultimately respond to that release to remediate it. And then we have a role in either directly overseeing that or auditing the activities of the licensed site professional who does the work.
Mr. Chairman, can I just follow up?
Yeah, please.
I hate to make this one-on-one, but again, as somewhat of an expert in safety management systems, risk assessment, hazard assessment, and what actually leads to accidents, I don't know in this realm. I mean, I know in my industry, for example, you can't touch an airplane unless you have a license. And there's a process to oversee and make sure everybody who gets near an airplane is in a drug testing program. Doing risk assessment of what's going to happen at this site, especially given what neophytes we are in this. As you said, Patrick, there are very few people who have done this before who are experts. Are we going to know, for example, A, that good risk assessment is going on? Is there more risk sweeping off a street versus actually the person who is operating the machine that is moving a canister or a cask? Is that person in the drug testing program? Has that person been adequately trained? I'm not saying the answer to that is no, but I am saying that as a committee, we need a peace and comfort that there is adequate risk assessment and safety management systems in place, and that the state really has to be looking at this stuff in some kind of systematic way. And I don't know, while there's trust here, I don't know that on the behalf of the citizens that is adequately covered. I don't know that it isn't. But I would love to have a presentation here that involves safety management, risk assessment, hazard assessment, and quality control relative to the process.
Rich?
A couple meetings ago, I had a comment regarding one of our town's priorities about what would happen if legacy waste were found after decommissioning is completed within the 8-year time window, and who would be responsible for that cleanup of that legacy waste. Now, I'm assuming, Patrick, that the site characterization study is really going to be focusing on the plant proper within the fence line. I feel it'd be unreasonable to expect Holtec to be putting an RFP out to say we want the contractor to do 20,000 boreholes with over the 1,500 acres looking for a needle in the haystack. But at the same time, will the RFP entertain any thought about the contractor looking at possible suspected areas where there could be some buried waste, if there was some information in the files that Entergy may have access to, or someone who may have, or Holtec, someone may have knowledge of where there could have been some buried waste, so that could be investigated during the site characterization study?
I wouldn't know it for sure, but I would assume that that's a big part of it, yes. Is historical data based on what's been there in the past.
David?
Can't provide any more specifics on that, as David said, where we're still working with Holtec on what their scope of an MOU might look like. But I can say that when their license is terminated, if legacy waste was found, like another radioactive material user in the state, if we went in after the site terminated their license and they said it was cleaned up and we found legacy waste, we would go back to the original licensee of that material, who would be financially responsible and regulatorily required to either have a license to clean it up and terminate it.
Okay. David?
Yeah, I think, we were talking about making stuff available to the public, and a lot of that discussion was on the results of the study. Are you getting input from the state on the draft RFP before it goes out to bid? I think David might have alluded to that, but it wasn't clear to me.
I have no knowledge of what input or interactions with the state. I'm not privy to the
Okay.
discussions.
So, well, can you make the draft RFP available so that we can get a sense of
Yeah,
what's going to be studied?
I'll find out what, publicly
that's-
what can go out.
That's something David and I can bring back to the interagency group to make sure they're aware that there's a I'll say it's an RFP, I don't know if it's an RFP, for that site characterization. And that's something that we should be able to have at least review on and input.
Great.
And to go to your questions, that would include access control requirements, drug testing, all those other things to get onto the site. And then the expertise, the level of expertise of the people that are participating, You don't bring in an electrician to do a plumber's job, basically, right? So you're gonna bring in somebody, a certified health physicist or somebody with the background and the credentials that can do that very specialized work.
Pine?
I think the question I still have that started this request to you was, does Holtec have the historic site assessment that Entergy did several years ago? Was that given to Holtec, and are you using that as a basis for anything, and can you give it to us?
I'll find out. That I don't know. I would assume that it has been, Pine, and I will find out.
I would assume that it has been too, and it seems to me that, if you were going out to bid to do, go prove me
Yeah.
kind of thing, which is, if you already have one that was only done a couple of years ago, you'd want to do your own to make sure that that's all there is kind of thing. I would have thought you would have done it already, but nonetheless, it would give us it would start the learning process for us, and it would help us to go, okay, we know they're gonna deal with this, and this. We're not sure what else they're gonna deal with, we're gonna find that out.
Sure.
But at least it gives us a chance to get up to speed, and eventually we're gonna get it, and it's so much better the sooner we get it.
Yep.
So
No, I understand.
Patrick,
Yeah.
what Pine's referring to, we had asked Entergy to provide the Part 75G
Yes,
Okay.
documents.
and they were about to give it to us.
Historical spills, chills, thrills,
Okay.
paperwork all through the NRC, and that never.
Okay, all right, so Part 75G, I'll write it down later, sit down, okay. Let me
Any other
take that back.
questions?
Thanks, I couldn't remember the part numbers.
I have a couple of questions, Pat. First, let me follow up on what Pine just mentioned. You said during the presentation that you understood that Holtec had in fact used elements of the site characterization report by Entergy in order to make some of your assumptions about what you thought you were going to accomplish.
I would assume so, I don't know that for sure, but I would assume so, yes. So
So-
I would assume they used any data provided by Entergy to
So,
go through this.
does Holtec have a copy of that site characterization?
That's what I think that's what Pine just asked me.
I'm just
I'm not
asking.
sure offhand, but I would assume so, and that's what I'm gonna look into.
And you may recall that your former colleague, Joe, had committed to providing the panel with it.
Okay.
If you have a copy, will you provide us with it?
Yeah. If I have a copy, absolutely.
Okay, we all heard it. That's great. No, that's great. That's all I got for that one. The next one that I have, I'm gonna just give it a blanket disappointment because of the miscommunication apparently.
Yep.
But it's at this work package level, and that was exactly the words Brian used, that we were expecting to see it at that level.
Yeah.
So for the next meeting, we're all on
No,
the same.
absolutely, and I'll work with John. You know,
All right,
John is
so
the
we're on
decommissioning
the same
director.
page with
We'll make that commitment.
We're not throwing Brian under the bus.
I'm not either.
I can't, I'll get yelled at when I
No,
say it.
no, I'm not either, so it's,
But I wish he had shared that with me, Sean, because I
Well,
would
he's
have,
gotta-
it would have made it easier for me to put my slides together.
he's got a lot on his mind, so we'll provide, okay. And then, I got only two more questions for you. When do you expect, from Holtec's position, that you're gonna reach this agreement with the state?
Honestly, I'm not privy to the conversations. I don't
So you
know.
know- have no
I
idea.
honestly don't know. No.
Can you find that out and give us a report on it?
I'll try. Absolutely.
Okay. And then, finally, what do you plan on briefing the Board of Selectmen on when you?
General overview of what's
I
going
thought
on.
we did that at the last meeting.
I haven't actually met with them.
Okay.
So since I've taken over in my new role, general overview. I do want to go over some of their points that were brought forward in their letter.
Are you ready to start making any positions known on that?
Well, we finished the EP grant already with the town of Plymouth. The screening issue is something that we're looking at. I think we can commit to doing some screening up at the upper pad. And then there's a number of things that are in there that are under, I would say, our discussions with the state that would be improper to say outside of that, from what I've been told.
Yeah.
And I think there's a number of things in there that we can look at and commit to maybe in the short term and some in the long term, so.
So is the pilot agreement one of those, for example?
Pilot agreement, I said that at the last meeting. I've committed to reopen the pilot agreement in the spring. We're gonna sit down and start talking. That was one of the first things when we sat down shortly after Holtec took over and I took over in my role, that we agreed to that already.
All right, and what about the land?
The land is something we've discussed as, you know, we're willing to work for what the potential end use might be. And that's the commitment we'll give, is we'll work with the town on what the end use might be.
Okay. Anybody else have any questions?
Just one,
Yes, Chris.
just came to me. Are you familiar with what Vermont Yankee, or not Vermont Yankee, what the town of Vernon is getting as compensation for spent fuel? Or I heard somebody the year of $10 million. Is that?
That I hadn't
I read it
heard.
in the minutes. I'll show it to you afterwards.
Yeah, no, I hadn't heard that number. The number I had heard for them for a pilot agreement is much, much smaller, but
Didn't
I'd want to
mention
confirm.
pilot.
Well, if they're getting anything, it'd be through a pilot agreement because,
Yeah, okay, thank you, Sean.
yeah.
Do we have one more over here, Paul?
Yes, sir. Thank you, the chair. For Mr. Patrick. So, your predecessor, Joe Lynch, and Mike Toomey, and then Mr. Jeremy
Parrott,
Vice
yeah.
President
Yeah.
of Holtec and CDNI. They had, before you took over, and
Yeah.
congratulations, but they
Thanks,
had promised, okay, that past employees of Pilgrim Station would get preference or would be considered in any new hires or part of the decommissioning process.
Mhm.
May I consider that with our new replacements, that still is true?
I would say yes, and I would say that we recently brought back one of those people into the emergency planning position. Well, we haven't had a lot of openings, but, and actually, we did just bring back 2 operators
Good.
that had left the company in June, but we brought them back in positions as needed.
Okay.
And actually, I take that back, and the safety person that was just hired as safety manager was a former contractor on the site that had been here a couple years ago. So yes, there is that preference.
So the promise hasn't been forgotten?
No.
Thank you.
Why, you looking to come back, Paul? Is that what you're fishing with me on?
Patrick, I was just wondering, is that pilot money coming out of the trust fund?
Yes.
Any other questions? Thank you very much,
Thanks,
Pat. Next topic for discussion is the recently filed NDCAP legislation by Senator Sear and Senator DiMacedo. Senator Wolf, since you wrote the original one in conjunction with Senator DiMacedo, would you like to open the discussion on this?
Mr. Chair, before we get into that, I want to express some concerns that I have as to whether the panel has the authority under the existing legislation to discuss in any manner legislation that would change our original enabling legislation to change the makeup of the panel as well as change the voting authorities of the panel, which are significant changes. And part two, as to whether the panel has the authority to discuss such legislation when its author is a panel member. And we understand it was developed outside of the panel, we were told that. However, now it's being brought back to the panel by the authors for the discussion here. And I think it's inappropriate. I think it would be safer for the panel to get an opinion from the Attorney General's office as to we have such authority. Once we get the opinion, if it's in the affirmative that we do, then it's simply a matter of the panel doing whatever it wants to do. If, however, it's not in the affirmative, then the panel would have to cease any such discussion and go back to its original charge.
Mr. O'Reilly.
Joe, is there anything in the original enabling legislation that causes you concern? Because I don't see
Yeah,
anything.
I don't see any such authority in it.
I don't see anything in the enabling authority that prohibits us from talking about anything.
That's why I say, because there's likely to be different opinions on this, and that's fair, fair read. I think we would be on much safer ground if we did get a clarifying opinion, and then I said, whatever that opinion is, we act on it. If it's positive, we then go into it however we want to.
Well, as the chair, I'm going to make a ruling. I appreciate your input on it. We're going to have a discussion on it, and if I'm proven wrong, that'll be it. Senator Wolf.
Yeah, since the makeup of the panel is going to preclude us from taking a vote relative to weighing in on the legislation anyway.
Right.
It seems like which is really kind of a catch-23, if you will. It seems like a fairly safe discussion to have, since we know at the beginning of the discussion, we're not going to weigh in as a panel.
Right.
So let me just state the obvious, because while we're on a panel, we're also individuals. And we have all served on this committee for a number of years now, and we all have formed opinions based on our effectiveness, based on our serving on the panel and what we've been able to do and not do. So my only thing is, I would encourage people as individuals of the panel to take that knowledge, experience, and expertise and weigh in. There's absolutely nothing I intend to do that. I think I've learned a lot, even though I was involved in actually getting this panel created. I've learned a lot in the last 2.5, 3 years that I think would make this panel more effective. And I intend to weigh in on that. And if the Attorney General's gonna file something on me, she can. I'm a friend of hers, I hope she does. So I don't wanna go looking for ethics issues or conflict issues when I think that would be a fool's chase, but I also don't think we need to spend our time doing it. I would encourage people to weigh in on the legislation.
Any other comments? Yes.
Yeah,
David.
I think it is an act of kind of public awareness. I agree with what Senator Wolf said. I mean, I was up there today. My sense of the timing is that it was filed as an amendment. It's Amendment 87 to the Senate supplemental budget, and that is going to be considered in the Senate starting tomorrow, I believe. So the time is now if members of the public are interested in sharing their opinion. It's also not in the House, and so it could be a conferenceable item at some point, and that'll probably, I think they're trying to resolve it by October 31st to meet some other fiscal issues. So the time is now. It's not something a month from now where if you do want to share your opinion, it's happening as we speak.
Do we have a slide we can show everybody so we're all talking about the same thing?
Well, I did not bring a slide, but because I didn't want to be accused of lobbying for this, but that was a joke, Joe. That's a joke. But I did distribute a copy of the draft legislation. You're more than welcome to mine, since I'm fairly familiar with it.
And I think all the amendments are available online, maybe on the Senate Ways and Means Committee site. I'm not exactly sure where it is in the legislative sites, but.
Did you get more of those?
Pardon me? Yeah, it's under bills. I checked on it today. It actually, with the help of Diane and a number of other people that have been following it and giving me updates. I spoke with Senator DiMacedo's office today. Senator DiMacedo and Senator Seer have sent the letter to the Rules Committee to ask it to be moved over to both so that it can be heard in this bill coming up. Yes, Rich?
Sean, since we've already talked about process, I want to talk a little bit about substance. I want to go back to last month. Can't hear you, Rich.
Yeah, you got it.
Okay, sorry. Since we've already been talking a moment ago about process, I want to talk a little bit about substance in terms of the pending legislation. And I want to go back to last month's meeting when you were bringing up the various points that were going to be in the pending legislations that turned out. And I do share some of the frustration you expressed about the difficulty in trying to vote on various motions. And this is even before I became a panel member last December. And I've expressed a lot of frustration from time to time when I wanted to see certain things passed on this panel, but we had abstentions or no votes from not just the Entergy and now two Holtec folks, but the cadre of ex officio folks who are much more populated on our panel than the Holtec folks when it comes to trying to get certain things passed. So I understand your point and understood your point about wanting to make have a non-voting member cadre on the panel there. But listening to this evening's discussions about the NPDES permit and the back and forth and just Patrick's presentation, and even on your agenda giving the Holtec update, and we're going to get more of an update next month on the agenda, provided that our licensees are still on our panel. I'm concerned about the legislation, and I don't like the legislation that's been proposed about taking the two licensees off this panel and replacing the two licensees with other folks. I have experience on the Nuclear Matters Committee for years, and I was the former chair, about the value of having licensees directly involved with a committee, or in this case, the panel. Moreover, when I first saw the proposed legislation, or I should say your thoughts from last month, you talked about just replacing the licensees. All of a sudden, I see in the pending legislation about it has to be two replacements from Barnstable. And I was thinking, wonder why two people from Barnstable? You know, when we had an operating plant, I could see if there was a potential for, or unlikely potential, but a potential for a nuclear radiological accident, and the winds happen to be blowing from the northwest. If I'm on the Cape, I'd be very concerned about that. But the plant is now shut down. Yes, we do have spent nuclear fuel on site, but the prevailing winds, as a meteorologist, are normally from the south. I would think the people up in Duxbury or Kingston would probably want to have more say if we were going to have a non-licensee panel member being appointed by our state legislative officials. Nothing personal against the people on the Cape, but I'm just thinking as a meteorologist outside the box, or I should say under the cloud. So I just wanted to voice a couple considerations here, and I'd like to even go so far, to the extent our panel may have some say and maybe influence our state legislative officials, to make a motion that the two licensees remain on the panel, but if there is going to be a decision at the state level about non-voting members there, they could be also made non-voting members, but still be on the panel.
Is that a motion?
Yes.
Did you get that motion, Alan? Is there a second to that motion?
Second.
Any debate on that?
I was wondering if Alan could read the motion back to us,
Make sure we got it.
just to make sure we get it right.
I'm not a stenographer.
Okay. So Rich, could you,
I could say it in 25 words or less.
yeah, could you just restate it and I'll try to write it down?
Okay.
That's good.
I'm making a motion that the pending legislation be modified such that the current licensees, or excuse me.
So the reps, the
Okay,
licensee
I guess section
representatives.
1 would be modified. Section 14 of chapter
You
188.
can just go to the section you're trying to modify.
Yeah, I'm right there.
Yeah, okay.
Section 1, Section 14 of Chapter 188 of the Act of 2016 is hereby amended in subsection A by striking the following. I'm just reading what it says now. 2 representatives of the Pilgrim Nuclear Power Station, also known in the section as the PNPS or station as selected by the owner of the station. Basically, that's removing the 2 licensees on the panel right now, as if I understood. So
Right.
I'm saying that I want to see that flushed down the
So-
toilet, quite
so-
frankly.
So can I summarize, just so everybody
Yeah,
on the
and-
panel knows what they're voting?
Okay,
So you're
thank you.
moving to strike section 1 of the proposed legislation?
I didn't, yeah.
And
Yeah,
section 2.
Yeah, and section 2 said said section is hereby further amended in subsection A by inserting the following after the word PNPS, and 2 members who reside in Barnstable County as selected by the President of the Senate. So,
So you want to strike section 1
Sections 1 and
2
2.
and keep sections 3 and 4?
but I would change section 3.
Well, hang on.
okay.
Hang on.
Oh, no, okay.
I'm not a stenographer either. So we're striking section 1 and 2 in your
And-
motion, and
And section 3, as it reads, is hereby amended in subsection B by inserting the following, after the word appointed, ex officio members shall be non-voting members of the panel. I don't know if we want to take a vote on the panel before, on another thought that ex officio members and the 2 licensees, if you want to have a vote on that, I can.
it's your motion.
It's your motion.
It's your motion.
Okay, I'll make a motion to discuss that and vote on that too.
All right, so the motion.
Should the 2 licensees be ex officio members too? I mean, or non-voting members, along with the ex officio members?
Is that part of the motion?
Yes.
Okay.
I missed that.
I think most of us did, but let's try
I
to.
think we need to discuss that too.
Why don't we,
Let me just rule on this.
Okay,
Let's get this straight.
okay.
Before we
Thank you.
open it to be. So we've got the framework of a motion. It's a little unclear, I think, to a lot of people, Rich.
Okay, I could summarize it in 25 words.
I
or
think
less.
I've got it summarized.
I'm gonna
Okay,
let-
I had to read this just.
Yeah, let
So
me,
the motion on the floor is to strike section 1 and 2 of the proposed legislation.
Yes.
Okay.
so we're going to advise, because that's what the panel does, that's what our charter does. We're going to advise the sponsor of this legislation to strike in accordance with your motion. That's what your motion is,
Yes.
because we don't actually do
Oh, no, I
legislation.
understand.
So now, is there a second on the revised motion?
I'll second that.
Second. Debate on the motion. Rich, David, rather?
Well, I think you've clarified part of my issue. But firstly, as you can imagine, the ex officios really can't comment on legislation. We've talked about that a number of times. It's not what our role is here or in our regular everyday job. We work for the administration. We don't comment on legislation that might make it to the governor's desk. But my other point you clarified, Sean, and that was that this is legislation being drafted by, kind of as a private individual reaching out to legislators to draft something that's been drafted, so it's not our position to modify it. But Sean correctly identified the fact that he's seeking to advise that this panel's view is as you've laid out.
Okay. Any other discussion on the motion? Senator?
Well, I'm going to move the vote, but before I do, I want to show you a map of prevailing winds. As somebody from Barnstable County who's been flying airplanes here for 42 years, the prevailing wind in the summer is out of the southwest, which goes directly over Barnstable County. And in the winter, it's in the northwest, which goes directly over Barnstable County. Prevailing winds, other than if it's an east wind, which is unusual, it's about between 10 and 12% of the time you have east or northeast or southeast winds here. So I just want to correct the meteorological fact. We can get into that argument later. But But I'd like to move the vote, because I don't think that.
The wind rose shows south.
Point of
Sorry,
order,
I
Mr.
looked at-
Chairman?
No, we're gonna take the next
Not
one, and then
gonna
we'll
do
have to take the point of order in a second.
Well, could I move the vote, though?
We have other discussion? Go ahead, John.
Yeah.
Yeah.
My question is, Mr. O'Brien, do either of you two have an official position on this, whether or not you're on this panel or not?
The more I sit here, it flips and flops. I'm saying that jokingly, John, but
I'm not.
I understand.
So, you know,
My
if you
my
weren't,
personal opinion is I see value in it, and I understand what the chairman did as an individual to present it. To me, as someone who has worked on legislation in my career, I would have probably just simply changed the quorum requirements. But we are 2 votes out of 21. And even with ex officio, which, if I understand ex officio, there are only 4 members from the state that are ex officio. There are 2 others that are appointed that are not ex officio. So it's really only 4 people that would be non-voting from there, and then you would make us either off the panel or non-voting. You still have, out of a 21-member panel, 15 votes.
It's not as clear as that, Pat, and I've heard your argument through other friends of yours. The arithmetic's flawed and the argument's flawed, but we're gonna go to the point of order.
I'd like to know, first of all, I don't know what you're referring to with my friends, because
I'm one of your friends. Rich, go ahead.
Yeah, just, the point of order was, if we're going to go to a vote, as the senator mentioned, I don't even understand what the motion is. Can we get
Yeah.
a full reading of the motion first?
Kevin, can you try to recap it?
The motion, as I understand it, in front of us, is that the panel, our panel, would vote to advise the authors of the proposed legislation to be modified to strike sections 1 and 2.
Is that correct? Okay. Do we have a motion to move the vote?
Can I,
Yeah, you want, go ahead, Paul. You go first, then Pine.
Okay, I always agree with mine, so. But my thought in defense of my position just was, in reviewing the PSDAR and the DSAR, I note that all the categories of which we adjudge the licensee and how they're gonna decommission and dismantle the site have a direct alignment with all of the Commonwealth's regulatory bodies. And so, and that's my objection. And as Mr. Patrick said, there's 15 votes there, okay? And they are the regulators for the state. I don't see where any service is provided by eliminating the 2, okay, who may object, okay, but more has been an experience that they educate. Fine, that's my point.
Thank you, Pine.
mine was, with your permission, sir, a question for Holtec.
Yeah, sure.
Is there any scenario that you can think of that if you were not on the panel, you would not attend these meetings?
I'm not gonna speculate on that, but, you know, I would provide what is laid out in the legislation as required by the licensee to provide.
Shall we move the vote? Oh, Pat?
I was gonna say, I agree, I think we should keep them on, at least the 2 licensee, because I think it's just a good thing, because they've been providing us with a lot of information, and they're the expert in that field anyway.
As a voting member?
Yeah.
As a voting member?
Yep.
They aren't in Vermont.
Okay.
Come
Now,
to every freaking meeting and make a presentation.
Mary,
Oh, sorry.
anybody,
I
any
wanna
other
go back
comment?
to my original motion,
Yeah.
because it sounded like we were gonna split, have 1 vote and then a second vote. Kevin read the motion correctly, and we're gonna vote on that.
Yeah.
And then after we vote on that, the next question is, okay, if the vote is affirmative and the licensees remain on the panel, based on what we feel as a group, then should they be voting members or non-voting members? That's the second part.
It's fine. We're going to take Senator Wolf's advice here and move the vote. We'll start with you, Samantha.
Abstain.
All in favor or no?
Oh, hang on.
Abstain?
Abstain.
We got to try to keep it, where is poor Alan?
I got it.
Okay,
I
Kevin's got it.
I got it.
Abstain.
I don't blame him.
Patrick?
I agree with section 2, I
section
don't agree
1,
with
yeah.
section 1.
Do you agree with the motion, or?
We're only voting, the motion we're voting on is to strike section 1 and 2 in the proposed legislation. I believe Rich has other motions he'd like to make after this vote is taken
On the pending.
on the pending legislation.
Yes.
Yes.
Are you in favor or against that motion?
Would that discussion be with section 1 after?
Remove section 1 and section 2.
You can come back with your own motion after if you'd like.
Absolutely.
Okay, I'll go along with it.
You're in favor? Susan?
Abstain.
Abstain? Joseph?
In favor.
No?
Robert? Abstain. David?
Abstain.
Robert?
Abstain.
Richard?
I'm in favor.
Kevin?
Yes,
You're in favor of his motion?
yes.
Okay. No?
No.
Yes.
Abstain.
Yes.
Abstain.
Yes.
Yes.
Abstain.
Does anybody have 11 votes, Kevin?
No.
The motion doesn't carry. Next, anybody else have further discussion on the legislation and what the panel may or may not want to do to advise both the sponsors and the legislature? Any other motions? Joseph?
Yes, to rescind section 3. I think the ex officio members, the way it currently exists in the legislation, that are voting members, I think provide valuable input to the panel. And as Rich mentioned earlier, they're the ones who are doing the negotiations with the licensee, and I think we need to support them in every way possible. And I think taking away their ability to be a voting member of the panel is an insult to the state, and I don't think it does anything to support and encourage their efforts with the negotiations with the licensee.
Would you like to put that in the form of a motion? Or?
Yeah, that section 3 be deleted from this draft.
Is there a second for that motion?
Second.
Discussion on the motion.
The fact that my motion got voted down, is there any point in modifying anything or having yet another motion that
Well-
if it turns out that the state legislative officials decided to keep our 2 licensees on the panel, that they be made ex officio members?
I
mean,
think
non-voting members.
you'd have to do that as a separate motion after we vote on this motion.
Okay, that's, I
So
just
let's
didn't know if I
focus
need to-
on-
I didn't know if I
on
need to
Joe's
make a
motion.
separate
So the
motion based
motion,
on what Joe
the motion
said.
on the floor right now is to
Okay.
delete section 3. Let's have the vote on that, and then
Okay.
we can come back.
Mr. Chairman,
Yes,
can I ask you a quick question?
absolutely.
Looks like he's coming.
If this legislation was filed personally by you.
It wasn't. It wasn't. It was.
No, I know it was done
Yes.
by Demacito and
was
Matt
authored by you.
Moratori, by
It was not
Demacito.
authored by me.
Oh, you went through in September and went through the details that are in this legislation
I
of
told
what
you-
you were gonna do. It's right in the minutes.
I told
What you were gonna do
Absolutely.
with a
I
member
didn't
of the
wri- I
legislature.
didn't write the
And now you're bringing it
legislation.
back here to us.
I didn't write the
You don't
legislation.
have to, that's a technical detail.
Well,
You're promoting your own
if the
agenda, not the
legislation,
panel's.
Mr. Chairman, if the legislation came from you, how can the NDCAP comment on it or vote on it?
Let me just clarify this. For those of you, and many were, including you, Joe, and Rich certainly, that were at the NRC meeting, I was pretty clear about my opinions at the NRC meeting. Following that meeting, I had discussions with a lot of people, including the 2 elected officials involved here. During those discussions, I described what I thought needed to be done to fix it, my personal opinion. They wrote the legislation they
And
own.
you gave the same views at our September meeting.
Absolutely, it's no different.
Okay?
I've been
But to have
consistent
the
throughout.
chair do that and then get them to draft, that's constituent services, that's normal, okay? But then to bring that back to promote your own agenda, I think that's totally inappropriate, and I think it's a conflict of interest.
And I find,
I would like to move
move the-
I'd like to move the question. We have a motion, we have a second. I say, let's move to the vote, please.
no further discussion. Sam? Abstain. Pat?
No.
No. Abstain. Susan?
Yes.
Yes.
No,
No. Abstain.
Abstain.
Abstain. Abstain. Yes.
No.
No. No, no.
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 Abstain.
No.
Yes.
Yes.
Abstain.
Has anybody achieved 11 votes?
No.
No, it doesn't pass. Okay, that's it for those. Next discussion is on the panel's working groups and whether we should reactivate them and get them going. And any discussion from the panel on the working groups? Yes.
I want to reactivate the site cleanup and restoration subcommittee and get to work. And I would like to invite Holtec to come and party with us, please.
I'll join. I know Warrenberger, I think, and Joe previously have been there, so I'll join.
Great idea. Go ahead and do it.
Anybody else?
Anybody else want to join?
Mr. Johnson was always a
Suggestion.
contributing member.
Yes.
If you want to reactivate the working groups, maybe what we ought to do is to meet and discuss what priorities we want to focus on for the rest of this year, and then bring those back to the panel and see what the panel as a whole thinks. And then from that point on, depending upon what the decision is, then the working groups can have at it.
Walk me through what you're thinking, Joe, in terms of we should meet. Are you thinking about doing it as individuals who were involved in the previous working groups, or are you thinking about doing it as a panel?
Hadn't thought of changing the working groups, but that's certainly an issue. My thinking was existing working groups, assuming that the members of those groups for the past couple of years want to stay on those groups. There have been some movements, not much, in between the groups in the past, and if any of them want to move around, that's up to them to bring forward to the chair. But it seems to me, we've had this discussion before, that it would probably benefit the panel. I assume that Senator Wolf operates that way within his company, that you set priorities for what you want to focus on, and then you move forward with them, and that helps give a structure for the rest of the year, what we want to do before we, towards the end of the year, get into the discussions for what goes into the annual report. Because with that kind of a focus,
God bless you.
it helps then channel substantive results from those working groups into the end of the year of what may want to go into the.
I think it's a great idea. Of those people here who were the chairs of the previous working groups, what are your thoughts on it, to just convene your group or check in with them? So we don't want to violate any open meeting laws. So, don't want to do that. What is the sense of it?
I think last year, Sean, or in the year before, when members decided for whatever reason they needed to move to another working group, they came back to the chair and just said, for whatever reason, could I transfer it to another one? And it was a no-brainer. It was an administrative thing.
Except there was 9 different versions of the same spreadsheet. So someone's going to get designated with that assignment, I can tell you that. Okay, so is that pretty much the consensus agreement, that the folks that had working groups before will convene together and just chat about it and what they want to prioritize and bring it back to the November meeting?
I mean, I was chair of, or co-chair with Kevin, I think, of the community and economic development, and I feel like that issue is largely being taken care of by the town and by the state in those discussions. I'm not sure there's a lot of extra that we would contribute to that, so, but I'm interested in Kevin's thoughts.
I actually would like to reform this so we can continue the discussions with the town and with Holtec, so we can come back and present to the panel anything that might be occurring. And I would invite, I know Joe was on the committee before, and if somebody would like to be on it, I promise the meetings will be short. I'll
Any other
take that offer.
Any other comments on this? Then go
My
forth.
meetings are going to be
As I say, provided you and Pine don't meet on the same day, I'll take
Go
you
forth,
up on that offer.
go forth and be productive. Under new business, the first topic I have is discussion, is we finished up once again and submitted our report, annual report. The process, because of no support services or, has been very burdensome, and I, for one, can tell you that I think we need to fix it, having been intimately involved in the production of the reports. So one of the suggestions might be to possibly create quarterly reports based on the minutes, have someone take a task or the assignment or the action item to create a quarterly report, and then we'll take a look at that as a group, and then turn that into 1/4 of the annual report and be done with it. I offer this as a subject for some discussion, and would like to hear anybody's ideas on it. But the process, as we've gone through for the last 2 years, is really untenable. So, Senator.
Yeah, the only thing I would add is that there are certain changes since we set up the structure of our groups. And one of the biggest ones is the interagency working group. And I would just like to make sure that as we look at the structure going forward, that we are adequately making sure that we have the right relationship and the right conduit to and from that group. And I'm not sure this structure does that.
Yeah.
So I don't know whether it means setting up a group that is directly, that is sort of getting a little bit more interaction between the IWG and this group, or how we do that, but I do think we need to do that. And form should follow function. I'm not sure the form that served us 2 years ago is the same form that should serve it now. Function's different.
Yeah.
Can I just follow up on the Senator's comments? We do, the folks here who are part of the interagency work group, report back to other folks in the administration at EEA. And that, I hope it has value. I think Sean in the past has commented that he felt like, word got back pretty well. But I do think there's some value to reporting back, as a committee, more regularly than once annually, with something that's more frequent, more digestible, kind of more pointed on where we are as things move. As we theoretically move into decommissioning, we may be seeing things change more quickly. So I do think there's, as Sean has talked about, some advantage to doing something short and sweet every quarter as an update.
Yes, Jack.
So we put out monthly meeting minutes that are very detailed. I don't think we should go, personally, I think we're going to create a bigger burden for us if we try to create quarterly reports, because although our intention would be to have a summarized report, you and Kevin and I working on the annual report, that didn't happen. That was what our intent was, and that didn't happen. So if we had better diligence from the subcommittees to report out at the regular scheduled meeting on what their activities are, that would be captured in the minutes. And then the executive summary or the annual report could be a much more simpler executive summary with our short recommendations, and we can reference people back to the meeting minutes for the activities of the subcommittee. And then I think that would make the annual report less burdensome. I think if you try to do quarterly reports, we could try it. It's up to the panel, but having worked with you guys on the annual, I think we're just going to create ourselves a bigger administrative burden.
Joe.
I think when the topic came up in the past, I can't remember whether it was in the September meeting or before that, yes, quarterly or some other frequency was mentioned. But I thought at the same time, even though we didn't discuss it in great detail, I thought what we said was maybe we would only do some sort of an interim report if something really unusual occurred that we didn't want to wait until the end of the year for the annual report. We wanted to take a position and maybe not just with the language that might be in the meeting minutes, but if we wanted to embellish even more as a result of some discussion of some very significant issue that the panel believed it wanted to bring to the attention directly to the recipients of the annual report. And I think we sort of left it there. We don't know if anything like that will occur during the year, but I thought the original point that was being made was, if some really unusual things do occur, why wait till the end of the year? Why not use the opportunity to bring it up and get the attention of the three different recipients of the reports?
Sean?
Yep.
We may also want to solicit up to the governor's office on how useful they found that 2 reports we've sent to them now, and any suggestions they might have for a change report. And that might help us focus what that executive summary would look like. Because if we're just giving them a 75-page stack of paper,
Yep.
it might be holding up the
Jack's
corner
point,
of the
Jack's
desk.
point, remember, we've discussed that in the past, that we've sent 2 reports forward, and we never get any comments. And so maybe it's time to then follow up the reports with saying, what value did they see with submitting the reports? We're simply following our legislative mandate, but we've never had any direct or official response for those.
We go to a lot of effort to do this. We want to provide,
Yes.
we want to have a product that's going to be useful to the governor's office to help with decision-making. So why not solicit back down, say, what changes could we do? Could we make this more simpler? Is there an area that you want us to provide more focus on?
And it'll give us more visibility to the panel and the extensive work that the panel members put into it during the years. We need some feedback. We just don't get it officially.
Senator?
Yeah, just again, form following function. I would much rather see a structure now, because we set up this structure with the working groups before there was an IWG. I'd rather have the committee chairs figure out a way to conduit with the state agencies that are working on all of these issues, from site restoration to somewhat on the economics, certainly to the safety, to the environmental impacts, and then report to this group in each of those areas. I think the working groups represent, I think we broke out the subject matter really well, but I think we have an opportunity to leverage some of the expertise that's going on with the IWG and the state agencies, that if we simply have working groups that are autonomous and not interacting with the IWG, it just doesn't make sense to me.
Doesn't make sense.
And so what I'd rather see is, the committee chairs in each of their subjects figure out how to connect to the state agencies in the IWG, and then report back to us what actually is going on in the agencies. That gives us the opportunity, real time, to respond to it, to react to it, to ask for more or less or different. But otherwise, we're having these autonomous working groups that are disconnected to everything that we worked to set up, which was the IWG. So
Yep.
Totally agree with Senator Wolf. In fact, I was having a similar conversation with one of the other panel members recently, that if we kept, if we started the working groups operative again, just thinking of one, I was the chair of the PSDR, that is so broad, but you're right, it was all set up prior to the creation of the IWG. And since there's no direct interaction, I mean, other than David, and we really appreciate what he does as the liaison, but I certainly, with the PSDAR work group, would have a difficult time going through and saying, okay, we want to figure out a way to kind of, and it's probably a bad word, but sort of monitor the decommissioning process as it's going on, even though we don't have any, I understand, legislative authority directly to do that. But nonetheless, figure out a way to do that, but not to do it without interacting with the IWG, because the IWG is going to be doing that anyway. And we don't want to be operating at cross purposes. We want to work together. And you're right. How we do that is the question.
Let me just offer an opinion here. Listening to everybody, I find myself in agreement with almost anything I heard. I think David's point, and again, forgive me because I'm thinking of it as equally much about the mechanics of actually doing this, having been engaged in it. I think David's point is well taken, that if we can have more periodic, smaller bites of the apple that are very succinct, that tie together what the panel's thoughts are and the IWG, and really focusing in on those things. So rather than the 73-page document, that, by the way, I don't think it's fair to characterize it that we haven't received any feedback, when in fact, we haven't received any acknowledgement of receipt. So I don't think that it's fair to characterize it that way. But in any case, here's what I'd like to suggest for the next meeting, that we've got to do something differently, both in the preparation, mechanics of it, and also how we focus on it. So if we could ask for those that are doing the working groups again, that one of the topics you discuss and come back with is a paragraph, a succinct thing, because I'm telling you, the actual preparation of this and then getting that through this organization, it's a lot of work. It's a lot of work. Now, many of you have devoted hours and hours to this. I get it, I know I have. But that's a lot of work, guys. So what I would like to suggest, since we all seem to have the same consensus here, that we want to more closely tie the panel's work with the corresponding IWG, and we need to provide more timely and easier, more digestible bites of what we think to help both the administration and the legislature, because I do think we advise the legislature. I'd just like to ask the working group chairs to come back with that at the November meeting.
What was it you looking for, Sean?
Is a succinct 1 or 2 paragraph thing that says, here's how we think we're gonna link it together with our charter, as, let's just pick on Pines for the moment, with the appropriate IWG agencies. And when we link those 2 together, or 3 together, or 5, what we're going to do is on a monthly or quarterly basis, we're gonna come up with the key points of what we really think at that time, based on where the 2 organizations are working.
Along those lines, I think it would be, I know that because David has always kept us informed and told us that he takes the discussions that occurred here back to the IWG and lets them know what has gone on here. In light of what you just said, I think it would be great if at the same time, when the work groups do what you asked, that if David takes this, the intent of the panel, the desire of the panel, back to the working group, and the working group comes back through David to us to say, look, we discussed the same thing, and we as the working groups have some suggestions as to how the working groups and the IWG may be able to work together on some of these things, so that we're mutually benefiting each other. Because I think it's very difficult if, no matter how well we try and define it, like Senator Wolf and you have just said, which I agree with, it's difficult to do that without having the input of the IWG at the same time. They may have some very good suggestions to say, okay, we're not talking about anything with regard to litigation. That's a whole separate issue. We're out of that. But from the charge that's in our legislation that we worked on the past couple of years and want to continue working on, maybe the members of the IWG will have some good suggestions as to, okay, focusing just on that legislative mandate, what might we able to get together and work together as partners, and then maybe we develop similar goals for the year or priorities for the year or something like that, just to give us some direct feedback so that we can all then understand we're on the same page and we work together.
Let me just give you one example, because sometimes it works better for me is if I have some concrete that says, oh, that's what we mean. And I think, in this case, something we heard from everybody tonight, and it'll go back to what Pat will bring to us next month, and it does in many ways speak to this whole idea of work packages. One of the things that would be a great example is that members of the panel and those individual work groups, I think we'd all agree that a critical piece of advice we can give to both the administration and a request to Holtec is that let's get out in front of things like the construction permitting. We know it's gonna happen. We all know it's gonna happen at some point. So to give as early a heads up as possible, that it is the advice of the panel and of the work group to pass through on a timely way, and that could be next January, to pass into the administration. That's the kind of specific that I'm thinking of, that ought to emulate. It's a two-sentence thing, it's not a big deal.
And it could be done as an interim
Sure.
recommendation.
And that rolls up to the larger.
Absolutely.
Okay. Everybody got the assignment and the approach? All right, next agenda item.
Time check.
Any old business? Hearing none, we've beat it most to death, haven't we, Pine?
Yeah.
Okay. Public comment, we're gonna give it 15 minutes tonight as promised. Well, how many do we have that would like to make comments? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Yes.
Can I have 30 seconds?
No,
to
yeah,
get
no.
to come?
I-
I was trying to get in before I went.
I'm sorry, go ahead,
Yeah.
Paul.
And, okay, and it's just that besides looking forward, looking back, when deregulation swept through the Commonwealth, there were some 21 large power plants that were all sold, and they're all coming to an age now where they're being subject to decommissioning and dismantlement. And I think there's some lessons that can be learned from them that will help make Pilgrim's decommissioning go safer and more efficient. And I was wondering, let's see, Mr. Johnston, once again, not to burden you, I know you're busy and have a lot of things, but Brayton Point recently was dismantling their power plant, and they have a lot of toxicity there. They have a lot of fly ash, they have a lot of hydrocarbons, they have a lot of toxins. I was wondering, and I don't need to know the results, but I wonder, is the state looking at Brayton Point and looking at it as they do in the aviation industry and in the nuclear industry? Are there lessons to be learned from demolishing or dismantling that could be applied to the other power plants in Massachusetts? That's just my question.
Yeah, I mean, I think we can learn lessons. You know, we've overseen dismantling of things before, and that's
Sure.
where the regulations for the requirement for an asbestos survey comes from. You know, the asbestos regulations were changed fairly recently to require a survey before a demolition occurs because it was a gap. And previously, you could do a demolition without necessarily surveying. You had to notify of the demolition, but you didn't have to notify and provide information about a survey. Now there are triggers where you have to do a survey, so we know if asbestos is present. So we catch up after the fact. So, you know, so our regulations are kind of, you know, set up to address these things. So it's not as though they're lacking. You know, in terms of Brayton Point, you know, it's not a nuclear facility, obviously. It is they have licensed solid waste disposal cells on the site that are in a 30-year monitoring program and have a financial assurance mechanism. So there's all kinds of monitoring data of the groundwater at Brayton Point of necessity because they're regulated as a solid waste facility. They also had a demolition of some cooling towers, and that was a time when we went in and we had to get involved in their plans for notification and for safeguarding the public from deposition of particulate and whatnot. So, you know, where Pilgrim is different is it's a nuclear plant. And, you know, on the interagency work group, we do have the gentleman from the Western region who oversaw that demolition for the Commonwealth, Dave Howland. He is part of the group and he doesn't come here, but he, you know, brings with him that experience, and he also, you know, was very keen to be aware of everything happening in Vermont. So are the lessons to be learned? Hopefully we learn lessons as we go and use them moving forward. And, you know, the risks are different, and I think the regulations are largely in place to address them. So I think also, you know, you have 4 members of the interagency work group here in the panel. And when we talk about somehow reaching out to the agencies, you know, we are the agencies.
Yes.
And if you have questions, That's why we're here. I mean, the whole point, I think, of having us here is to answer the questions. So I don't know that, I think we are sort of unnecessarily tied up with this frustration of how do we communicate with the interstate work group. You kind of are basically communicating with the interstate work group. You know, there are regular members, 4 of us are part of those. We meet, we don't actually meet in person as regularly as we once did. We talk on the phone all the time. And, you know, and I think, you know, I try to bring these briefings back every month. And what doesn't, I think, get across in the briefing is I think you all have a sense that the interagency work group, you know, we're working on a plethora of things all the time. And that's just not true. You know, when something like the Npdes permit comes in, you cannot imagine the amount of hours and staff time and number of individuals we have brought in to try to work with EPA to have the right document and, you know, recognizing that it's a nuclear facility. So, you know, so when you get the update of the interagency work group, that is what we've been doing for the last month. And it has been a bucket load of work. Hours a week. There are days where I'm spending 5 or 6 hours on Pilgrim, and I'm not the only one. So you know, a lot of this stuff does get communicated back to the interstate work group. You know, we report out on these meetings, and we discuss the briefings you all get before the meetings. And the agency folks are here as agency people. The interagency work group are the agency people. We're the same people. So ask the questions. If we can't answer them, we're not doing our job. And if you know, if you have something specific to ask the interagency work group, ask it. Put it in one of the updates, whatever. And you know, we'll try to get to that.
Thank you, David. We're gonna go to
No, that wasn't my question. I appreciate the hard work of the state agencies. All I'm asking is, besides sharing amongst themselves, the lessons to be learned, like the causes of the fire
I think that's
from the act.
I think that's one of the things that should come right out of the work groups.
Right, and it should be shared with the licensees.
Absolutely. Everybody should.
Yeah, thank you.
Public comment, how many again? Let's show of hands. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 now. If we stay longer, we might get it lower, but, so we're gonna do 3 minutes apiece at 6 for 18 minutes. We'll start in the front row. Diane, please.
Hi. I just want to acknowledge Pine and thank her for all the hard work she did over the years to get those permits for the water to save our bay and the marine life. Thank you, Pine. You know, this has been such a wild meeting. But the wildest thing was a slide that you put up, Mr. O'Brien, that may be why there aren't people here. You said, there was a question, that last slide, that said, how long until fuel from Pilgrim could go to a potential interim storage facility proposed in New Mexico?
Correct.
And Holtec's answer was, if everything goes according to schedule, the earliest the facility would be completed would be 2024, and accepting shipments after that.
Correct.
Do you think that implies that this waste is going to be gone in 4 years?
No,
What does that mean?
that means what Rich asked me last meeting.
Yeah,
Asked me for the earliest the facility could open
Right.
and when Pilgrims could be. What I said is, I don't have a time frame on Pilgrims, and the earliest the facility could be licensed and open is 2024.
2024 it says here, and accepting shipments after that.
Yes.
Would it be accepting shipments from Pilgrim?
It
It's
could
kind of
be.
implied,
It could be.
exactly. Well,
I just
that's,
said- But I also said it in the beginning of my comments
Right.
was, I'm not saying that when Pilgrim would be staged in this. I'm just saying the facility itself, based
Right.
on the timeline,
right,
could open no earlier than 2024.
right. Would be completed by 2020, and accepting shipments, and you said it could be from Pilgrim. So what I'm saying is, you're implying that by 2024, people could assume that shipments would be going to New Mexico.
No, that's not what I said at
Oh.
all. If you go back and read the
Okay.
minutes, exactly what I said was, I don't know when Pilgrims would be in line for that. What I said was, the
Could it?
earliest the facility could open is 2024.
Okay. Could Pilgrim shipments be in line to leave on 2024 when that facility opens? I know, I want to get,
What are you trying to get at, Tank? I don't get where you're trying to go with this. What I'm trying
Okay,
to say is,
when I
the
looked at
earliest
this
the facility
question-
in the licensing process right now,
Right.
the NRC could be constructed and
Yes.
open is 2024. What I started that whole conversation with is,
Right. I don't know when Pilgrim would be staged in that. Okay. I'm just saying, implied from, well, if I could go I'm not back trying to and, imply anything. I'm literally telling you, I don't know when Pilgrim's fuel would go off of that. okay. But what I'm saying, on the slide, it said accepting shipments after that. If I was a resident of Plymouth and I saw that on TV, I would think, that must mean that they'll be accepting shipments from Pilgrim after I am a 2024. Plymouth resident, and I don't take it that way. I Okay. take it as the way I said it. Okay. The earliest that facility could take waste from anywhere in the country could be 2024. Right. And could that be Pilgrim? I wouldn't venture to guess when Pilgrims would be in line to go to that facility,
Okay,
if
but-
and when that proposed site even gets licensed and built.
Okay, well, that's my next statement.
Well,
Okay.
you run out of time.
Oh, can I just read this?
Yep, read it quick.
Okay, so the Nuclear Waste Policy Act states that a centralized facility can only be constructed if a permanent repository is operating. Furthermore, the portion of the law that allows for temporary sites, storage sites, has expired, deeming any such facility illegal under existing law. So my point is, HOTEC is promoting that they will be having an interim storage site in New Mexico, and that's not going to happen. And so people need to recognize that Plymouth, is a nuclear waste dump for the indefinable future. And I just have one quick question, because he took up all my time. So I wanted to ask you, now that the casks are being moved up, which is good, what is Holtec doing to prevent a line-of-sight attack?
There'll be security measures in place, but one of the things that the town had asked for was visual screening.
Okay. What will Holtec be putting in place?
We haven't gotten
Security?
that agreement with the
Because
town.
I've walked on the property, as you know, many times
you
for
walked
over
into
half an
our- you
hour.
walked into our
And you
parking
can,
lot, I understand.
no, you can go right on it, line of sight, for
Okay,
half an
thanks.
hour and no security comes out. Thank you.
Next on this side. Yep. Oh, I missed the second row. We'll get you next. Please say your name and
Certainly, I'll be happy to.
Keep these meetings back to 8:30.
Good evening. My name is Mary Gatzlick, and I have lived in Plymouth within mostly 3 miles of this plant for the past 33 years. And for the past 28 years of those, I've been working at the station. With that being said, the comments I make this evening are my own. I do not represent anyone but myself. I'm concerned with the bill that was filed by Team. If passed, this will remove the representatives from Pilgrim Station, replacing them with individuals who reside in Barnstable County. It also removes the voting rights of the appointed ex officio members and replaces the required 2/3 majority vote with a simple majority of the voting members. Wow. Talk about hamstringing a committee. I can only imagine who'll be appointed from Barnstable County, which, by the way, as was pointed out, is not even in the emergency planning zone. How can you consider the plant-appointed people as major obstacles? That's a quote from an interview. They're some of the only people with actual experience in emergency planning and decommissioning currently on the panel. If you want to restore the citizen back to this panel, you should at least look for someone who has a viewpoint other than that of anti-nuclear. I've attended a lot of your NDCAP meetings in the past, and it appears to me that the group has forgotten its original purpose. The panel shall serve in an advisory capacity only and shall not have authority to direct decommissioning of Pilgrim. They will advise the governor, the general court, the agencies of the Commonwealth, and the public on issues related to decommissioning of Pilgrim. How can you advise when you have stripped the real-world experience from this panel and have basically gagged the officials? The meetings I've attended in the past have sounded more like hostile interrogations. You seem to have forgotten that the decommissioning process is controlled by the federal government, not by the Commonwealth of Massachusetts, not by the town of Plymouth, and certainly not by this committee. Other citizens' advisory panels in the United States have included members from the licensee staff. Why is it that the Plymouth NDCAP thinks removing the only people who can provide actual working knowledge is a good idea? My question to you, is it because you don't like the way they voted? It sure seems like that to me. How can this committee be taken seriously? Decommissioning is a technically sophisticated process.
The proposed new makeup of this NDCAP is certainly not qualified to advise. My only comment to you, the hubris of this committee actually astounds me. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Next.
Chuck 80, Plymouth resident for 48 years, and until my retirement last year, I spent 54 years working in the nuclear power and electrical power industry. I'd like to thank the panel again. I realize how much hard work this is for you people to get together and do all that you do. And even Jim and Mary, the members of the public spend a lot of time putting their effort into making their presentations. I'd also like to credit you on the report. I thought it was an excellent report. And not only was it an excellent and thorough report, I think it gave a thorough capture of all the public comments, and that's really unusual. I've got 4 points that I'd like to make, and in my 3 minutes, I'm going to have to kind of summarize all of this. Some of them have to do with a couple of topics that are reported in the report, and I think they really should be revisited. One is the 10 millirem cleanup standard versus the 25 millirem cleanup standard, and also the town is suggesting that all detectable tritium should be removed. There are lots of technical reasons why this doesn't make any sense at all. The International Commission on Radiological Protection even has a standard higher than the NRC's. Theirs is 30 millirem per year. In the case of tritium, it's everywhere, and its biologically half-life is only 10 days, and its impact on the human body is almost indeterminable. And the standards for cleanup in the United States is 740 becquerels per liter. That's the NRC standard, which is in U.S. standards 20,000 picocuries per liter. The standard for the World Health Organization is 10,000 becquerels per liter. And there are some countries that have a standard even higher than that. So based on that, I think these two things really need to be reconsidered, and particularly because they'll be expending a lot of decommissioning trust fund money that could be better spent elsewhere. The nuclear waste. Here's something I firmly believe, and I'm old enough to have seen a lot of technological advancements. We are going to find a way to extract valuable material in addition to the fuel, the unspent fuel that's in that waste. And it's going to happen, maybe not next year or the next year, but certainly within the next couple of decades. And why do I believe that? Well, I was in South Africa in 1984. And I saw them tearing down these mill tailings. They're absolutely mountains of material. And I inquired as to what it was.
Chuck, I could listen to you for an hour, I really could. But in the sake of fairness to everybody, if you've got other comments, please send them to us. I mean,
Yes.
I'd love to read them personally. I know that other members would.
Okay.
But for the sake of fairness, we got to,
Okay, that's it?
I'd love to hear it.
All right.
Who's next? Yep.
My name is Dave Noyes. I'm an employee of CDI at Pilgrim, speaking as a private citizen and resident of Plymouth. I have 4 questions of the panel with respect to the proposed legislation to change the composition and voting rights of the ex officio members of NDCAP. In the interest of time, I'll pose all 4 for panel consideration and give others a chance to talk. Has anyone taken the time to attempt to determine why the panel composition that works in Vermont, and as near as I can tell, every other decommissioning plant in the U.S. can't work here? Number 2, does replacing 2 panel members, one a 30-year nuclear professional and the other a Plymouth resident respected by both local politicians and business leaders, with 2 individuals whose sole qualification is Barnstable County residency, really improve the effectiveness of the panel? Or shouldn't the existing panel diversity with proper leadership
promote more responsible challenge to the prudent use of the limited resources of the Decommissioning Trust Fund. Number 3, the proposal was designated by its authors as emergency legislation, necessary for immediate preservation of the public safety and health. If the panel composition were truly a matter of public health and safety, why does its charter say its role is advisory with no regulatory authority? And finally, if this legislation passes in the interest of truth in advertising, will you seize the opportunity to shorten the panel name to Mullen, Wolf, and Friends? Thank you.
Thank you. Much more credit than I deserve. Who's next? Jim?
Just a couple of things. First, just to fill in some gaps on where does everything stand down at the NRC, et cetera. Holtec and Energy have moved to intervene. I think I read that either Monday or Tuesday. The next question would be, to which nobody knows the answer, is will there be a motion by Holtec or Energy to dismiss on procedural, not substantive grounds? I would not be surprised, but I think that's one of the things that probably can be expected, and I'm not going to give you any hope on what the result may be. Third, that assuming it goes forward, and as in any other appeal, it will then move forward into briefing. So the statute, they moved to intervene. I think high likelihood is it will be granted. The NRC favored it. The state took no position. The question then will be, will the NRC and Holtec try to get rid of it on procedural, not substantive grounds? And then third, will we go ahead into a normal briefing schedule and let the Court of Appeals proceed as it usually does? But that's the structure that we're working with right now and what might be expected. One thing came up really in the discussions tonight is, okay, what is this panel going to focus on? What should it be doing? And I have a suggestion. And I think the suggestion is that focus, at least one of the major focuses, has to be on all aspects of spent fuel. And that, I see, to have two specific suggestions on what should be done with respect to that. The first is, I think this panel needs to hear at the same time, so they can discuss it between themselves, from Dr. Singh, who's obviously designed a lot of casks and has a lot of experience with them, and has been quite upfront on some of the limitations on them, and either Dr. Alvarez or Dr. Thompson or both, who have also done a great deal of work and study on what are the risks on casks. And if this panel would set aside a meeting to hear from those three gentlemen, and frankly give them most of the time, I think we would learn a great deal about what are we really talking about cask design, cask risks, and how we might deal with them, but otherwise simply will not be brought to the fore. The second deals with the idea of the working groups. I think to get the working groups reestablished and going forward is a very good idea. There's been the opportunity for discussion at those groups at a level of detail and consideration, and frankly, including all people involved, that is simply impossible the way the panel meetings themselves work. I would hope they go forward. I would hope that, as in the past, they would continue to work not only with the panel members who show up, but also the interested public members who frankly have a lot of factual information that should be entered into the discussions, and it's impossible for the public to get to this panel as it stands now. Working groups, yes. Set the priorities, yes. And I look forward to working with the working groups and this panel, both to get priorities for this, can this panel do, set and established, priorities that hopefully might be accomplished. Because believe it or not, there are things the state can do. So let's not tilt at windmills. Let's look at what we can accomplish to make this better for everybody.
Thank you, Jim. Mary?
Yes. Obviously, I feel the same, that there should be a set of priorities for this committee to narrow its focus on what it decides is important, as opposed to sort of, as things come up, more scattered approach. Spent fuel is a big one. Obviously, the other big one is site cleanup.
I was talking to a friend who was involved in Yankee Atomic, and she was mentioning to me when tritium was found 300 feet below ground level. And also having read, and I hope all of you have read, the expert declaration for the Attorney General's motion written by Jack Priest that talks about what you likely will find if, in fact, it's looked for. And so I think it's important to consider what is necessary for protecting public health and safety. That because the PSDAR says Holtec intends to remove buildings 3 feet, go 3 feet below ground. That's not 300 feet, but 3 feet. And so I think there should be a discussion and a focus on what should occur to structures left below 3 feet, basements of buildings that have contaminated materials, buried pipes, buried tanks that are below 3 feet. The settlement agreement for Vermont was very specific. I would think you would consider having requirements that no hazardous waste in excess to DEP state standards would be allowed to remain in those structures. If it can't be removed, those structures would have to be removed. As far as radioactive material, total disagreement to a previous speaker. I think the state should move on a 2-track process to get the less than 10 and less than 4. The 2-track, continue your discussions with Holtec to get a memo if you can. But at the same time, you should be having the Department of Public Health enact a regulation. They have the authority to do it if the governor is so encouraged to do so. That would be the expedient, quick way to do it. And it would simply, as we've talked before, have to be in language that after the site is decommissioned, then there is no preemption. Also, it would be important to emphasize a dose assessment process called the basement inventory. So you would go around the basement and the floor of the reactor building left in the ground and assure it doesn't exceed the standard, as opposed to watering down the final number by averaging in the clean fill, which is another way to do dose, which obviously is something we don't want. Third, we do want, as you pointed out, the state to be part in an exploratory way and to justify, to assure what the licensee is saying. Because I understand with DEP that you go in and look at their reports. Let me just finish the sentence. Look at their reports, but you don't dig yourself unless there is a notification that there's contamination there. Well, I would like a more proactive.
Thank you very much. Is there anybody else before we, is there a motion to adjourn?
So motion.
Second? Second. All in favor? Aye. Thank you all very much. It's been a long evening.
You know, I think they need that.